The day I poured the concrete for Tom's wall was 2 years and 3 months after I buried him. The numbers mattered because grief counts time differently than calendars do. 783 days since the funeral, 614 since I'd stopped setting 2 coffee cups out each morning, 409 since I could say his name without my voice breaking, 112 since I'd stopped apologizing to empty rooms for crying. Time becomes arithmetic when someone dies. You count forward from loss instead of backward from birth. You measure healing in coffee cups and voice cracks, and the small, sharp moments when you forget they're gone, and turn to tell them something before the absence hits again, harder than before. Diane Hartley thought I was building a barrier to keep her ATVs out. She had no idea I was building a vault to keep Tom's last wishes in, and her lies out. By the time Diane discovered what was sealed inside that concrete, it would cost her the kingdom she'd built on other people's compliance. And I'd finally understand what Tom meant when he wrote in his journal, "Sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear." But that morning, as the wet concrete caught the light and turned it gold, I was just a widow finishing her husband's last project, the one he'd sketched 2 months before his heart stopped beating, the one he'd designed with engineering precision and desperate hope, knowing he might not live to see it built. I was keeping a promise. That's what you do when someone dies mid-conversation. You finish their sentences. The late afternoon sun hit the wet concrete at an angle that turned it gold, like honey poured over stone. The air smelled of dust and cement, and the wild sage growing along the property line that Tom had always meant to transplant closer to the house, but never found time for. My knees ached from kneeling on the gravel, and my shoulders burned from hours of smoothing wet concrete with the trowel. I was 56 years old, and building a wall alone because my husband had designed it before he died, and I'd promised myself, promised him, promised the silence that held his absence, that I would finish what he started. Some promises you keep for the living, others you keep for the dead. The second kind matter more because there's no one left to release you from them. I was smoothing the top edge, watching the trowel leave clean arcs in its wake like a zipper closing over something that needed sealing, when I heard her Mercedes SUV before I saw it. The engine had that particular purr of expensive machinery driven by someone who believed price tags conferred authority. The sound cut through the quiet afternoon like scissors through fabric, deliberate and sharp and utterly confident. I didn't look up. I'd spent 30 years teaching high school English, and one thing you learn fast in a classroom full of teenagers testing boundaries is that bullies feed on attention the way fires feed on oxygen. Starve them and they burn out, or they escalate. Diane Hartley was an escalator. The SUV door slammed with more force than necessary, the kind of slam that announces arrival and demands acknowledgement. Gravel crunched under designer heels, the expensive kind that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and had never touched real dirt before today. Quick and purposeful footsteps, measured to convey both urgency and control. I taught teenage girls long enough to recognize performative confidence when I heard it. The sound alone told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. I kept my eyes on the concrete, watching the trowel leave smooth arcs in its wake. Tom would have approved of the technique. He taught me how to finish concrete the summer we built the patio together, back when we thought we had decades ahead of us instead of months, back when retirement meant projects and travel and growing old slowly together, finishing each other's sentences and holding hands in movie theaters. Back before his heart decided our story was shorter than we'd planned. Margaret. Her voice had that practiced tone of concern that didn't reach past her teeth, let alone her eyes. I knew because I'd finally looked up, met her gaze with the same neutral expression I'd perfected for parent-teacher conferences with mothers who thought their child's failing grade was my fault. Professional concern is a weapon when wielded properly. Diane Hartley wielded it like a scalpel, precise and cold and designed to cut. I straightened slowly, feeling every one of my 56 years settle into my lower back like stones into mud. Pouring concrete alone tested joints I'd forgotten existed, reminded me that I wasn't young anymore, and that some tasks are harder solo than they should be. But I'd started alone, and I'd finish alone because that's what widowhood was, learning to do everything yourself that you used to do together. I met Diane Hartley's gaze and waited. Another teacher trick. Silence makes people nervous. Nervous people fill silence with truth, or at least with information they didn't mean to share. I'd learned patience the hard way, grading essays and waiting for teenagers to confess who'd cheated on the exam. Waiting worked. It almost always worked. She didn't disappoint. "We need to discuss the situation," Diane continued when I didn't speak, stepping closer to the wooden forms that held the wet concrete. She wore designer athleisure, the kind that had never seen actual athletics, and carried a clipboard like a weapon or a shield. Maybe both. This isn't how neighbors treat each other. The implication hung in the air between us like smoke. I was being unreasonable, hostile, unneighborly. All the soft words that really meant you're not doing what I want, and I'm displeased. I met her eyes and still didn't speak. Just stood there, trowel in hand, concrete dust on my jeans, waiting for her to say what we both knew she'd come to say. She stepped closer to the wooden forms, examining the work with the air of someone conducting an inspection they had absolutely no authority to conduct. "Tom understood community," she said. And there it was, the weapon she thought would work. My dead husband's name, invoked like a spell. He'd want you to honor that. The use of Tom's name as leverage hit exactly as she'd intended it to hit. It landed in my chest like a fist, sharp and sudden and designed to hurt. But she'd miscalculated. I wasn't the same woman Tom had married 32 years ago, full of hope and plans and certainty that love conquered everything. And I definitely wasn't the same woman who'd stood at his graveside watching them lower him into ground that shouldn't have been his yet, still young enough that his death felt like theft rather than tragedy. Grief changes you. It rewrites your boundaries and redefines your tolerance for bullshit. I had very little tolerance left. "Don't speak for my husband, Diane." My voice came out quieter than I'd expected, but steady as concrete. "You didn't know him well enough for that." Her practiced smile tightened at the edges, small cracks appearing in the veneer. For just a moment, I saw what lay beneath the concerned neighbor routine. Raw frustration at being told no by someone she'd already categorized as manageable. A grieving widow. Easy to dismiss, easy to control through social pressure and false sympathy. She'd miscalculated badly. "I'm trying to help you." She shifted tactics, softening her voice into something meant to sound gentle. "Grief can cloud judgment, make us act in ways that hurt our community, hurt ourselves." The implication was clear. I was acting irrationally, emotionally, the way women of a certain age were supposed to act when widowed and alone and making decisions without male guidance. I'd heard it before from other people, delivered with more kindness, but the same underlying assumption. Poor Margaret. She's not thinking clearly. She's not herself. I was exactly myself. That was the problem. I set the trowel down on the wooden form with deliberate care, metal ringing against wood in the quiet afternoon. A small sound that somehow felt significant, a line being drawn. "This is my property," I said, each word precise and clear. "The concrete is permitted, the construction is legal. We're done here." "We're not done," she said, and for just a heartbeat the mask slipped entirely. I saw what she'd been hiding under the concern in the clipboard and the designer clothes. Anger, real and hot and barely controlled. Fury at being challenged, at being told no. Some people confuse authority with permission. They believe titles and positions grant them rights over other people's choices, other people's property, other people's lives. Diane Hartley had been HOA president long enough to forget the difference between leadership and ownership. I was about to remind her. "Tom never had a problem with people using the back road," she said, voice sharp now, the pretense of gentleness abandoned. "Why are you suddenly making this difficult?" Because Tom did have a problem with it. Because in the last 8 months of his life, he documented every violation, every ignored boundary, every dismissive response from this woman standing in front of me. Because I'd found his journals and finally understood that the stress eating at him in those final months hadn't been about retirement or aging or fear of death. It had been about fighting a battle alone, while his wife was too consumed with lesson plans and parent-teacher conferences, and the small daily dramas of high school English classes, to notice her husband was drowning in frustration and unheard complaints, and the kind of low-grade harassment that looks like nothing until it becomes everything. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Evidence had its time and place, and this wasn't it. Get off my property, Diane. The words hung in the air between us, simple and absolute. A line drawn in language as clear as the wall I was building would be in concrete. She studied me for a long moment, recalculating her approach. I could see her mind working behind her eyes, shifting strategies like a chess player reconsidering the board. Then she smiled again, colder this time, a smile with edges sharp enough to cut. "I'll see you at the HOA meeting next week," she said, making it sound like a threat disguised as an invitation. "We'll be discussing this. The board needs to address unauthorized obstructions to community access." She turned to leave, heels crunching on gravel, but paused at her car door. The pause was calculated. Everything about Diane Hartley was calculated. She looked back at me with something almost like pity, except pity doesn't have teeth. "You know, widowhood has made you brittle." The words landed soft and vicious. Tom was such a reasonable man, cooperative. It's a shame you don't share his nature. The implication coiled under the words like a snake. Tom had been agreeable, accommodating, easy to work with. I was none of those things. I was difficult, unreasonable, changed by grief into something hard and hostile. The subtext was clear. My husband would be disappointed in what I'd become. The car door shut. The engine purred. Gravel crunched under expensive tires. I stood there watching dust settle in the air, my hands still flecked with concrete, and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Not grief, though grief was there too, constant and familiar as breathing. Clarity. Tom had been fighting her. Fighting this. And I'd been too distracted with my own world to see it, too wrapped up in my classroom and my students and my small daily concerns, to notice my husband needed backup. Now I would finish what he'd started. Not for revenge, for completion, for the promise implicit in 32 years of marriage. We finish each other's fights. The property spread out around me in the golden light of late afternoon. 40 acres of oak and pasture and wild grass that Tom and I had bought 5 years ago, as a surprise for our 30th anniversary. He'd handed me the deed over breakfast on a Saturday morning, grinning like a kid with a secret too good to keep. Our retirement dream, he'd said. A place where we could finally breathe, where we could slow down and remember what mattered. I hadn't known then that he'd have less than 5 years to breathe here. Hadn't known that the heart attack would come sudden and massive on a Tuesday morning while I was at school teaching Hamlet to sophomores who didn't care about Danish princes or father's ghosts or revenge delayed until too late. By the time I got to the hospital, Tom was already gone. No goodbyes, no last words, no final "I love you" to carry me through what came after. Just absence where presence used to be, an emptiness shaped exactly like my husband. I'd stayed on the property because selling felt like betrayal. This was Tom's dream, our dream. The land held him in a way the empty house in town never could. I could feel him here in the workshop he'd built, in the half-finished deck he'd started the summer before he died, in the garden beds he'd plotted out with engineering precision, and labeled with his neat handwriting on stakes he'd cut from oak branches. And now, in the wall I was building from his blueprint, his design, his last project, his final fight. The back 40 acres sloped down toward a creek, thick with oak and wild grass that needed cutting every summer to keep the fire risk low. An old access road, barely more than 2 tire tracks worn into the earth, cut across the lower section near the property line. It dated back to the 80s, some kind of fire road the county had used back when volunteers drove trucks through the hills watching for smoke. They'd decommissioned it 20 years ago when they rerouted, left it to fade back into grass and wildflowers. Tom had researched it thoroughly when we bought the property, found the decommissioning paperwork, confirmed what the property deed already stated clear and legal. Private land, no easement, no public right-of-way. The road belonged to us, the land belonged to us, the boundaries belonged to us. But somewhere in the last 10 years, that old fire road had become a shortcut, a convenience for residents of the newer development that had sprung up on the adjacent property, like mushrooms after rain. Instead of taking the paved road that looped around to the highway, people cut through our land, saved maybe 3 minutes, avoided a single stoplight, treated private property like public access because no one had stopped them yet. At first, it had been occasional, barely noticeable, a car or two on weekends, Then more frequent. Then ATVs, loud ones, tearing through the grass and churning up mud in the spring. Then constant, like a right instead of a trespass. Tom had tried the polite approach, signs, friendly conversations with neighbors, formal requests to the HOA to remind residents about private property boundaries. He'd documented it all in the engineering journals he kept, the same meticulous notation he'd used for structural calculations and building codes, and the precise measurements of everything he built. I'd found those journals 2 months after the funeral, when I'd finally been able to face the workshop without breaking down. They were stacked on his workbench, leather-bound and neat, his handwriting small and precise. I'd opened the most recent one expecting equipment notes or project sketches, maybe plans for the deck expansion he'd been excited about. Instead, I'd found a chronicle of escalating frustration, a documentary of a man trying to defend his boundaries against someone who refused to acknowledge they existed. May 3rd. Found 3 new tire tracks across the back 40 this morning. A TV marks, deep enough to damage the young oaks we planted last fall. Signs are gone again. 4th set this month. Snapped off at the base and thrown into the brush. Margaret doesn't know about any of this. She has enough stress with the Anderson situation at school. That parent complaint about grades won't burden her with something I can handle myself. That entry alone made me cry. Tom protecting me from stress while stress was slowly killing him. Carrying weight alone because he thought I couldn't bear any more. Not knowing that I was stronger than he thought, or that I would have gladly shared the burden if I'd known it existed. May 17th. Approached HOA President Diane Hartley at the community meeting. Explained the situation politely, professionally. Asked for HOA support in reminding residents about private property respect. She smiled and said I was making mountains out of molehills. Asked her to show me the documentation of the legal easement she claims exists. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. Something about her tone reminds me of Principal Watkins from the district office years ago. That same entitled certainty that rules don't actually apply to people in positions of authority. That same dismissiveness toward legitimate concerns. May 24th. Still no response from Diane Hartley. Sent follow-up email. No reply. Saw her at the grocery store. She avoided eye contact. Starting to think this isn't oversight. It's intentional. June 2nd. No response to 3 emails. Went to her real estate office. She was professionally dismissive, said the community has used that route for years, that I was being hostile to community spirit. Hostile. Like asking people to respect my property line is aggression. Asked again for legal documentation of any easement. She got visibly angry under the pleasant mask. Said maybe I should spend less time worrying about old roads and more time enjoying retirement. Not a legal answer. Not even a civil one. This woman thinks authority means immunity. June 15th. Margaret came home stressed about final exams and the Crawford parent who's threatening to go to the superintendent about Jenny Crawford's failing grade. Didn't tell her about finding beer cans and cigarette butts scattered across the lower pasture. Picked them up myself. She needs to focus on finishing the school year strong, not this petty garbage from neighbors who think our land is their playground. The entries went on, each one more frustrated than the last, each one documenting violations and dismissals and the slow erosion of Tom's patience, each one hiding the conflict from me because he thought he was protecting me. I'd sat in his workshop for hours after reading those journals, holding the leather books against my chest, and crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. All those months of his last year, I'd been so wrapped up in my own world. School politics and budget cuts and the eternal drama of teenagers and parents. I'd noticed Tom seemed tired sometimes, a little stressed, but I'd chalked it up to retirement adjustment, the shift from working 60 hours a week to having time on his hands. I hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't paid close enough attention, hadn't noticed my husband was fighting a battle that was literally affecting his health. And Tom, being Tom, had carried the burden alone rather than add to my stress, had protected me right up until his heart gave out. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest, heavy as concrete, but beneath the guilt was something harder and clearer, fury at the woman who'd made my husband's final months miserable over a dirt road she had no legal right to. The final entry about the HOA was dated 3 days before Tom's death. I'd read it so many times I had it memorized. June 28th. Confronted Diane Hartley again after finding a TV ruts deep enough to damage the irrigation line I'd installed for the new trees. asked her directly to take action. She actually laughed. Not a polite deflection. Actual laughter. Said maybe I should spend less time protecting dirt and more time protecting my health. She knows about the heart condition. The whole board knows from the liability insurance disclosure forms. She knows and she said it anyway. This isn't ignorance. It's calculated cruelty dressed up as community building. Couldn't sleep last night. Chest felt tight for hours. Didn't mention it to Margaret. She has the department meeting tomorrow about budget cuts and staffing. We'll call Dr. Morrison's office next week about the blood pressure medication. Need to document everything about this road situation. Build a case that can't be dismissed. Diane Hartley isn't trustworthy. She'll lie if confronted directly. Need evidence that speaks louder than her lies. He'd never made that call to Dr. Morrison. The heart attack came first, massive and sudden in the garden on a Tuesday morning. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. I'd stood in the workshop holding that journal, reading that last entry over and over, and understood with crystalline clarity that Diane Hartley had contributed to my husband's death. Not directly, not legally, but morally. Absolutely. She'd harassed a man with a documented heart condition, made cruel remarks about his health, and created stress that manifested in sleepless nights and chest pain and blood pressure spikes that went unchecked because he was too worried about me to take care of himself. The guilt threatened to drown me, but the fury kept me afloat. I'd started with the same polite approach Tom had used, because I wanted to give the system a chance to work. New signs, carefully worded. Private property, no trespassing. Please respect our boundaries. I'd made them myself on weather-resistant material, printed them at the office supply store, posted them at 3 points along the old road with posts I'd driven deep into the ground. They lasted 2 days before someone tore them down. I replaced them. They disappeared again within 24 hours, vanished like they'd never existed. The third set I found snapped off at the base and thrown into the creek, floating among the reeds like litter. The message was clear. Courtesy would be met with contempt. Politeness would be answered with destruction. So I'd escalated. Went to an HOA meeting, walked into that beige community center with its smell of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, and politely requested time to speak during the open comment period. Diane Hartley had been at the head table, perfectly composed in her blazer and statement necklace, flanked by board members who looked at her for cues before responding to anything. I'd presented my case simply and clearly. Private property, no legal easement, repeated trespassing, and property damage. Signs destroyed multiple times. Request for HOA support in reminding residents to respect property boundaries and private land. Diane had smiled that practice smile and said, "We appreciate your concern, Margaret, but that route has been used by the community for over a decade. It's become something of a tradition. Tom never raised any objections." The lie was so smooth, I'd almost missed it. So practiced that half the room nodded in agreement. But I'd come prepared. I'd brought Tom's journals. I pulled them out of my bag and read aloud, my voice steady in the quiet room. Read his dated entries documenting conversations with Diane Hartley. Read his record of her dismissals and deflections. Read his requests for legal documentation that she never provided. Read his frustration and his professional observations, and his growing certainty that something wasn't right. The room had gone very, very quiet. Diane's smile had frozen into something brittle and thin. Her hands tightened on her clipboard. "Tom was under a lot of stress those final months," she said, voice smooth but eyes sharp. "The medications he was on for his heart condition can affect perception, memory, emotional stability. I'm sure he believed what he wrote, but..." She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. My dead husband had been confused, unreliable, not quite right in the head. The medications made him paranoid, made him see problems that didn't exist. His journals weren't evidence, they were symptoms. Several people in this room had nodded sympathetically. Poor Margaret, they were thinking. Dealing with a husband whose mind was going before his death. No wonder she's being difficult now. She's working through complicated grief. I'd felt the anger then, white and cold and absolutely clear. But I'd kept my voice level, my expression neutral. Teacher face. The same face I used for parents who insisted their child's plagiarism was actually independent research. "My husband was a civil engineer for 40 years, I said quietly. His mind was sharp and clear until the day he died. These journals are dated, cross-referenced with county records, and completely accurate. Diane, where's the documentation of the easement you claimed existed when Tom asked for it? She'd deflected smoothly, like she'd practiced the move. This isn't the time or place for hostile confrontations. We'll look into it and get back to you with the appropriate documentation. Tom asked you to look into it over a year ago. You never did. You never responded to his emails. You avoided him at public events. You dismissed his legitimate concerns as mountains out of molehills. When will you actually provide the legal documentation you keep claiming exists? The board treasurer, a nervous woman named Linda Chen, who'd been silent through the whole exchange, had spoken up then. Her voice was tentative but determined. Maybe we should actually review the property records before making any decisions. If there's no legal easement on file, we can't claim community access. Diane had shut that down fast. We don't need to waste time and money on bureaucratic paper chasing. This is about community cooperation, not legal technicalities. Margaret, I understand you're grieving, but isolating yourself from neighbors isn't healthy. Blocking access that's been traditional for years isn't the answer. The meeting had moved on. My time was up. The board voted to table the discussion pending further review, which meant nothing would happen, nothing would change. I'd left with nothing but the certainty that polite requests would get me nowhere. That the system was designed to protect people like Diane, people with titles and positions and the social capital to control narratives. I drove home in silence, Tom's journals on the passenger seat, and understood what he'd understood months before he died. Sometimes, the only way to enforce a boundary is to make it physical, make it undeniable, make it impossible to ignore or dismiss or rewrite. That night, I'd sat in Tom's workshop and reread his journals cover to cover, every page, every entry, looking for anything I'd missed, any clue about what to do next. And in the back pages of the most recent journal, I found it. A blueprint, not for a deck or a shed or any of the dozen projects Tom had sketched over the years. This was different, deliberate, specific. A wall. Tom had designed it with the same engineering precision he brought to everything. Dimensions and materials, load calculations and stress tests. But this wasn't a simple fence or property marker. It was substantial. 6 feet high at its peak, 3 feet thick at the base, built with reinforced concrete and steel rebar. And hollow chambers. 5 of them, built into the structure at strategic points. Sealed cavities with concealed access panels and waterproof gaskets. Annotations in his small, precise handwriting. Documentation vault, fireproof, waterproof, tamper-evident, for evidence preservation and protection. He'd planned this, designed a wall that wasn't just a barrier, but a repository, a physical structure that would keep truth safe from people who preferred it buried, a solution that would outlast both of us, that would speak even when we couldn't. The blueprint was dated 8 weeks before his death. He'd been preparing for the fight to escalate, knowing it would. He'd understood that Diane Hartley wouldn't stop, that polite requests were useless against someone who confused authority with ownership, and he'd created the solution. Left it for me like a gift, like a roadmap, like a voice speaking across death saying, here's how you finish this, here's how you make them listen, here's how you make the truth permanent. I traced my fingers over his handwriting, feeling the indent of his pen in the paper, the weight of his certainty, the evidence of his love still protecting me even now, even gone. This was his voice speaking across the silence, his engineering genius applied to a problem that had cost him sleep and peace and, I believed, years of life. I could finish it. I had his blueprint, I had the property rights, I had the permits, which I'd applied for the next morning, describing it accurately as an agricultural retaining wall and fence structure. The county had approved within a week, no questions asked. And I had the motivation that comes from keeping a promise to someone who can't witness you keep it. The motivation that comes from love that survives death and transforms into purpose. I would build Tom's wall. I would seal the truth inside it. And Diane Hartley would learn what Tom had known. Some boundaries can't be talked away or dismissed or rewritten. Some boundaries are made of concrete and steel, and the absolute certainty that truth matters more than comfort. The concrete pour had started at dawn on a Wednesday. I'd hired a small truck from Jensen Concrete, a contractor Tom had worked with on various projects over the years. The driver was a weathered man in his 50s named Dave, who'd known Tom professionally and personally. He'd looked at the forms I'd built, the rebar framework, the depth of the foundation, and whistled low. "That's substantial work for a property line marker," he'd observed, not judging, just noting. "Tom designed this?" "Yes," I'd said. "I'm following his specifications exactly." Dave had nodded slowly, understanding something in my tone that I hadn't said out loud. Tom was a good engineer. Probably overbuilt this like he overbuilt everything, but it'll outlast us all. He'd paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Webb. He was a good man." "He was," I'd agreed. "That's why I'm finishing his work." We'd poured the foundation in silence, Dave operating the truck chute while I spread and smoothed the concrete into the forms. The work was hard and hot and absolutely necessary. By noon, the truck was empty and Dave was gone, and I was alone with fresh concrete and a trowel, smoothing the surface the way Tom had taught me that summer we'd worked together on the patio. That's when Diane had arrived for the first time. Driven by once, then twice, then stopped, gotten out, and stood watching me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now standing in the fading light looking at the finished foundation, I understood what Tom had felt in those last months. The clarity that comes from being dismissed one time too many. The determination that grows from knowing you're right and being told you're wrong. The cold certainty that some fights are worth having even when you're fighting alone. But I wasn't alone anymore. Tom had left me this blueprint, this plan, this final project that would say what needed saying long after both of us were gone. Tomorrow I'd start building the vertical walls. Next week I'd install the sealed chambers, each one containing carefully preserved evidence. In a month, if I kept to Tom's timeline, the wall would be complete. And inside, it would be everything Diane Hartley had tried to dismiss, deny, and bury. Every journal entry, every photograph of damage, every ignored request and documented lie, every piece of evidence that Tom had gathered and I had expanded. The truth, made permanent, made undeniable, made impossible to ignore. Some promises you keep for the living, others you keep for the dead. This one I was keeping for both. The next morning brought rain, delaying the vertical wall construction. I used the time to visit my attorney, Marcus Webb. No relation despite the shared last name, just one of those coincidences that felt less coincidental after Tom died. Marcus had handled our estate planning, our wills, all the paperwork that prepares you for death in theory but never in practice. His office smelled like leather and old paper, and the kind of quiet money that doesn't need to advertise itself. He listened to my explanation without interrupting, reviewed Tom's blueprint spread across his mahogany desk, examined my documentation with the careful attention of someone trained to find problems before they find you. "Legally bulletproof," he said finally, tapping the property survey. "Your land, your right. The wall is permitted. The construction is within code. The documentation chambers are creative, but entirely legitimate. You're essentially building a very sturdy filing cabinet that happens to be 6 feet tall and made of concrete." "And the fail-safe release?" I asked. "If someone tries to destroy the wall or access the chambers without authorization." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll set it up through my firm. Automated system. If the wall is damaged, if you notify me of any tampering attempt, or if you're unable to check in quarterly for any reason, everything inside gets released simultaneously." He made notes on his legal pad in small, precise handwriting that reminded me of Tom's. County Planning Commission, HOA Board, local media, all at once, no warning. "How long to set it up?" 3 days. I'll need digital copies of everything you're sealing in the chambers." I'd brought them on a USB drive. He took it, labeled it with a case number, and locked it in his office safe. Professional. Careful. Exactly what I needed. What? "Margaret," he said as I stood to leave. "Are you sure about this? Diane Hartley has resources, connections. This could get messy." "It's already messy," I said. "I'm just making sure the truth survives the mess." He nodded and didn't try to talk me out of it. Some lawyers would have. Marcus understood that legal advice and life advice aren't the same thing, and sometimes people need support more than they need caution. By the time I left his office, the rain had stopped and sun broke through clouds in shafts that looked almost biblical, light pouring through breaks in the gray like something from a Renaissance painting. Back at the property, I found a visitor, an older woman I recognized vaguely from the neighborhood, standing by her car near the wall site, looking uncertain and determined at the same time. She turned as I pulled up, smiled tentatively. the way people smile when they're not sure of their welcome. Margaret, I'm Catherine Rivera. Everyone calls me Kate. I live on Sycamore Drive, about half a mile from here. She paused, measuring my reaction. I was at the HOA meeting last month. Heard what you said about Tom. I remembered her vaguely. Older, maybe mid-60s, sitting in the back row. She'd looked uncomfortable during Diane's response, but hadn't spoken. Can I help you? I asked, not unfriendly but cautious. I'd learned caution since Tom died. I wanted to talk to you. About Tom. About what Diane said. She hesitated, glancing at the wall foundation behind me. Can we sit for a minute? We sat on the tailgate of my truck, looking out over the property. The concrete foundation was dark with rain, solid and real, and somehow comforting in its permanence. Tom came to me about 6 months before he died, Kate said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a confession too long held. He was frustrated. Said Diane was making his life miserable over the access road, that she kept dismissing his concerns and wouldn't provide legal documentation for the easement she claimed existed. She paused, staring at her hands. I told him he was absolutely right to stand his ground, that she had no legal authority to demand access to your property. I told him I agreed with him completely. But, I said, hearing the unspoken word, but I didn't say anything publicly, didn't speak up at board meetings, didn't support him where it would have mattered. She looked at me directly, eyes bright with unshed tears. I was afraid. Of what? Diane has a way of making life difficult for people who cross her. Small things. HOA violations for petty infractions nobody else gets cited for. Social exclusion. Being left out of neighborhood events. She's very good at it. Subtle. And I'm a widow too. Alone. Didn't want the hassle or the isolation. She took a shaky breath. But when you stood up at that meeting and she implied Tom's mind wasn't sound, that his concerns weren't valid, I knew it was a lie. I knew it and I said nothing. I let her gaslight a dead man and I sat there silent. Her honesty surprised me. Most people avoid that kind of direct admission of failure. They rationalize or minimize or shift blame. Kate did none of those things. I'm ashamed, she continued. I owed Tom the truth. I owed you the truth. And I came here today to offer it, late as it is. If you need someone to verify what Tom told me, to testify that his mind was clear and his concerns were legitimate and documented, I'll do it. I'll stand up this time. I owe him that. I owe you that. I studied her for a long moment. Kate Rivera was offering me something precious. An ally, a witness, someone willing to say publicly what she'd kept private. In a fight against someone like Diane Hartley, that mattered more than most people understood. Thank you, I said simply. That took courage to admit. And yes, I might need you to testify to that when the time comes. Relief washed over her face, visible and real. Call me anytime, day or night. She pulled out a business card, old-fashioned and slightly worn. My cell's on there. I mean it, Margaret. Anything you need. Before she left, she looked at the wall foundation one more time. Tom showed me the blueprint once, about 2 months before he died. Said if things escalated, he'd need to make the boundary undeniable. He was preparing for this. He was, I agreed. He just didn't live to finish it. But you will, Kate said. Not a question, a certainty. Yes, I said, I will. Catherine Rivera became my first real ally in the fight. She didn't have much to offer beyond her testimony and moral support, but sometimes that's everything. Sometimes knowing you're not alone matters more than having resources or connections. She'd given me something I hadn't had since Tom died, solidarity. The vertical forms went up over the next week. I worked steadily, measuring and cutting lumber, building the framework that would shape the concrete walls, following Tom's blueprint exactly, checking every measurement twice, the way he would have done. The wall would run 40 feet along the most used section of the old road, blocking vehicular access completely. Anyone wanting to use the shortcut after this would have to drive through grass and trees, making the trespass obvious and undeniable. Neighbors slowed down as they drove past. Some waved, friendly or curious. Some stared, evaluating or judging. A few stopped to ask what I was building. A wall, I said each time, offering nothing more. Seems like a lot of work just to keep people out, one man observed, leaning on his car door, trying for casual conversation. It's not just a wall, I replied. It's a promise I made to someone who can't see it finished. He'd nodded, not understanding, but recognizing something in my tone that discouraged further questions, and driven away. On the 6th day of construction, as I was installing the reinforcing steel rebar framework, a truck pulled up and parked near the worksite. I recognized it immediately. My neighbor, Rick Barnes, retired contractor, early 60s, lived on the adjacent property with his wife, Janet. Good people, the kind who minded their own business but showed up when you needed help. The kind of neighbors Tom had valued. Rick approached slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, the universal body language of meaning, no trouble. I'd met him and Janet at a neighborhood cookout years ago, back when Tom was alive and social gatherings felt manageable instead of exhausting. "Saw you working out here all week," Rick said, stopping a respectful distance away. "That's Tom's design, isn't it? He showed it to me once." I straightened from the rebar I'd been securing, surprised. "He did?" About 3 months before he passed. We were talking about a deck project he was planning, and the conversation drifted to the property line issues he was having. He showed me this blueprint, asked me what I thought about the engineering. Rick looked at the framework, the careful measurements, the reinforced structure. I told him it was solid work, overbuilt for a simple barrier, but if he wanted something permanent that would last beyond both of you, it would do the job. "Did he tell you why he was planning it?" "Said the HOA president was making his life hell over the access road, that she wouldn't listen to reason, kept dismissing his documented concerns, and that eventually he'd need to solve the problem with something she couldn't ignore, dismiss, or tear down." Rick met my eyes directly. "I'm glad you're finishing it. Tom was a good man. Didn't deserve the stress she put him through." "You knew about that?" "Hard to miss. He looked worn down those last few months. Tired in a way that wasn't just physical. I recognized it because I'd seen it before in other people being harassed by HOA boards. It's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting battles nobody acknowledges are real." Rick hesitated, then made a decision. "Look, I don't usually get involved in neighborhood politics. Janet and I keep to ourselves mostly, stay out of the drama. But if you need a hand with the heavy work, pouring the walls, bracing the forms, anything like that, I'm around. No charge. Call it a favor to Tom's memory." I accepted. Not because I couldn't do it alone, though the work would go faster with help, but because refusing assistance isn't strength when it's offered genuinely. It's just stubbornness disguised as independence, and I'd spent enough years teaching to know the difference. The wall went up faster with Rick's help. He understood structure and engineering, asked intelligent questions about the design, worked efficiently without unnecessary conversation. We fell into a rhythm: measure, cut, brace, check. The forms rose section by section, transforming Tom's blueprint from paper to three-dimensional reality. On the day we poured the vertical walls, mixing and pumping concrete into the forms around the steel reinforcement, Diane drove by, not once, 3 times. The third time she stopped, got out of her Mercedes, and stood watching us work with an expression that cycled between disbelief and anger. She didn't approach immediately, just stood there, phone in hand, taking photos or video, documenting, the way Tom had documented. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, she walked over, stopped at the property line, careful not to actually trespass. Smart. "This is excessive, Margaret," she called, voice tight with controlled fury. "You're being hostile, creating an eyesore, blocking community access that's existed for years." I kept working, didn't respond. Rick glanced at me, taking his cue from my silence. "I'm going to have the county inspect this," Diane continued, voice rising slightly. "Make sure it's up to code. Make sure you're not creating a safety hazard or violating setback requirements." "Already permitted," Rick said mildly, not looking up from the concrete he was smoothing. "County reviewed and approved it. It's her land, her right. All legal." Diane's mouth tightened, her jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought she might actually step onto the property, cross that line physically, the way she'd been crossing it legally for years. But she didn't. "This isn't over," she said, and got back in her car. "She's going to escalate," Rick observed quietly after Diane drove away. "I know," I said, and kept working. Before we sealed the wall completely, before the concrete fully cured and became permanent, I installed the 5 chambers exactly where Tom's blueprint specified. each one a hollow cavity built into the wall's structure, each one sized to hold a waterproof document case, each one with a concealed access panel that looked like solid concrete unless you knew exactly where to look. I'd prepared the contents over the previous week, working late into the nights in Tom's workshop. 5 document cases, industrial grade, waterproof and fireproof, each one carefully packed. Chamber 1 held property documentation. The original deed with our names on it, mine and Tom's joint ownership. The survey maps showing precise boundaries. County records showing no easement, no right-of-way, no public access. The permits for the wall itself. The paper trail that established my absolute legal right to build exactly what I was building. Chamber 2 held Tom's journals. Not the originals, those stayed in my safe deposit box, but complete copies. Every page photographed in high resolution and printed. Every entry that documented the problem, tracked the violations, recorded Diane's dismissals. Tom's voice, preserved in ink and concrete. Chamber 3 held evidence of violations. Photographs of destroyed signs, each one dated and annotated with locations. Measurements of ATV damage to young trees. Timeline of incidents. Video footage from the trail camera I'd installed after the 3rd set of signs disappeared. Everything Tom had documented, plus what I'd added in the months since his death. Chamber 4 held communications with the HOA, printed emails, certified mail receipts, meeting minutes from the gathering where I'd raised the issue publicly. Diane's dismissive responses. The pattern of stonewalling and deflection, documented in writing that couldn't be denied or reframed. Chamber 5 held what I'd discovered about motive, the Riley development proposal for Hartley Meadows, the zoning variance application that cited established community access through my property, the commission structure showing Diane's financial stake, the proof that this wasn't about community or tradition or convenience. It was about money, $180,000 of it. I sealed each case carefully, tested the waterproof gaskets, verified the access panels. Rick helped me place them into their designated cavities in the wall structure, working carefully to ensure the concrete would flow around them properly without compromising their integrity. He saw me placing the cases but didn't ask what was inside. Just helped me position them correctly, making sure each one was level and secure before we closed the forms around them. Tom thought of everything, Rick said quietly, looking at the blueprint spread on my truck tailgate, seeing the detailed notes about chamber placement and access. He always did, I said. The wall took 2 full weeks to complete from first foundation pour to final form removal. When we stripped away the wooden forms, it stood exactly as Tom had designed it. Solid, imposing, utterly undeniable. 6 feet high at its peak, 3 feet thick at the base, following the gentle slope of the land like it had grown there naturally. The concrete had cured to a pale gray that would weather and darken over time, eventually blending with the landscape. But for now it looked new and deliberate and absolutely immovable. A statement rendered in concrete and steel. Rick stood back, studying the completed work with the critical eye of someone who'd built things for 40 years. "That'll outlast both of us," he said with quiet satisfaction. "Probably outlast the house. Tom built for permanence." I ran my hand over the surface, still slightly rough from the wooden forms, feeling the texture under my palm, cool and solid and real. Tom's blueprint, made physical, his voice, speaking in concrete, his certainty that truth mattered, that boundaries deserved defense, that some promises were worth keeping even when the person you made them to was gone. "Thank you," I said to Rick, "for understanding, for helping, for not asking questions." "Thank Tom," he replied, gathering his tools. "This was his fight first. You're just finishing it for him." He paused at his truck. "She'll come after this, you know. Diane doesn't give up easy when she thinks she's entitled to something." "Neither do I," said. He smiled at that, a brief flash of approval. "No, I don't imagine you do." That evening, I stood alone in front of the completed wall as the sun set, Tom's journal open in my hands to that final entry about Diane Hartley. The one where he'd written about sleepless nights and chest pain and the need to document everything because she wasn't trustworthy. The entry dated 3 days before his heart stopped beating. I read it aloud to the wall, to the chamber sealed inside, to the truth preserved in concrete and protected by steel and waterproofing and Tom's meticulous planning. You were right about her, I said, speaking to Tom the way I'd been speaking to him for 2 years. Conversations with the dead are one-sided, but necessary. She wasn't trustworthy. She lied and dismissed and gaslit you until it affected your health. But you knew that. You saw it coming. You prepared for it. I closed the journal, held it against my chest. I finished your wall, Tom. Our wall. Whatever comes next, the truth is protected. It's permanent. It can't be dismissed or denied or destroyed without consequences. I promise you that. The concrete held no answers, gave no response, but it held something better than answers: permanence. Evidence that couldn't be talked away or dismissed or hidden. Truth made physical, made undeniable, made impossible to ignore. Some boundaries were worth defending. Some truths needed more than words to survive. Sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to let lies become history. I'd built a wall following my husband's blueprint, but really I'd built a witness, silent, patient, and absolutely certain of what it held inside. Diane Hartley was about to discover that widows who finish their husbands' fights don't do it halfway. The wall wasn't just concrete. It was a promise kept, a truth preserved, a boundary made permanent. And sealed inside were secrets that would change everything once she forced me to reveal them. The wall was complete, the chambers were sealed, the failsafe was set, the real fight was just beginning. The emergency HOA meeting had 62 attendees. I counted them as I walked in, old teacher habit, the kind of automatic assessment that never leaves you even after retirement. Always knowing exactly how many people were in the room, where they were sitting, who was watching, who was avoiding eye contact. 62 people Diane had convinced I was the unreasonable one. 62 neighbors who'd chosen to believe her carefully constructed version of events over documented evidence they'd never seen. 62 witnesses to what came next, though most of them didn't know they were about to watch someone's authority crumble. The parking lot had been full when I arrived, cars crammed into spaces and overflowing onto the grass. People wanted a show, wanted to see the difficult widow get put in her place by the competent HOA president, wanted their beliefs confirmed that the wall was unreasonable, that I was being hostile, that everything would go back to normal once Diane handled this little problem. They had no idea what normal was about to become. But Diane had forgotten something crucial about me, about who I'd been before I became someone's widow. I'd spent 30 years teaching high school English to teenage girls, navigating the intricate social warfare of adolescent hierarchies, documenting bullying with the precision of a forensic investigator, because one mistake could mean a lawsuit. I taught thousands of students to trust their own perceptions, even when authority figures denied reality, to build cases with evidence instead of emotion, to stand firm when people tried to gaslight them into doubting themselves. Diane Hartley thought she was dealing with a grieving widow who'd eventually back down under social pressure. She had no idea she was dealing with a woman who'd spent 3 decades teaching young women how to stand up to people exactly like her, who knew every manipulation tactic because she'd watched them deployed by teenage queens who thought they ruled their little kingdoms. Diane was just a middle-aged version of the same archetype. More polish, more resources, same fundamental playbook. And I'd been grading that playbook for 30 years. The meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening on a Thursday. Community center, same beige building with its smell of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee. Same folding chairs arranged in rows facing the head table. Diane sat at the center like a judge, flanked by Linda Chen, the treasurer, looking nervous, and 2 male board members whose names I could never remember because they never spoke unless Diane told them to. The agenda was projected on the screen behind them in letters large enough to see from the back row. My name appeared 3 times. Item 4, unauthorized construction. Item 6, community safety concerns. Item 9, property access discussion. She'd structured the meeting to make me the problem, the obstacle, the hostile neighbor disrupting community harmony. I'd come prepared. The room quieted when I walked in, conversations dying mid-sentence the way they do when the subject of gossip appears. I felt 62 pairs of eyes tracking my movement down the center aisle, some sympathetic, most evaluating, a few openly hostile. I chose a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to be heard clearly, but not so close it looked aggressive. Teacher positioning. Command the room without dominating it. Kate Rivera was already there, sitting in the middle section. She caught my eye and nodded once, deliberate and clear. Solidarity. Rick and Janet Barnes sat near the back, Rick's arms crossed, Janet's hands folded in her lap. Silent witnesses. Allies who wouldn't speak unless necessary but whose presence mattered. Diane called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. She was nothing if not punctual. That kind of person always is, mistaking strict adherence to schedule for actual leadership. She went through preliminary business quickly, approving minutes and financial reports with barely a pause for discussion. The board members nodded in unison like synchronized swimmers. Then she reached item 4. We have a serious matter to address tonight, Diane began, and I had to admire the performance, even as I recognized it for what it was. Her voice carried just the right note of reluctant concern, like someone forced to discuss an uncomfortable topic out of duty rather than desire. A situation that affects all of us. Community safety, property values, the spirit of cooperation that makes our neighborhood special. She clicked to the next slide. Photos of my wall appeared on the screen, taken from multiple angles. She'd been thorough in her documentation. The images made the wall look harsh and aggressive, a concrete barrier rising from the earth like a threat. This structure was built without community consultation, Diane continued, without consideration for how it affects established access patterns, without regard for the concerns of neighbors who've used that route for over a decade. Established access patterns. The language was careful, designed to sound official without being legally specific. She was good at that, at using words that implied authority without actually claiming it outright. I want to show you something, she said, advancing the slides. A photo appeared of a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, showing a scrape on his arm. 7 years ago, my son Drew was injured on that route. A bike accident. Nothing serious, thank God, but it reminded me how important safe community access is, how we need to maintain these traditional paths for emergency situations. I recognized the manipulation immediately, invoking her son, showing the injury, creating an emotional connection between the shortcut and child safety. Never mind that the accident had been minor, that it had happened years ago, that it had nothing to do with my property rights. She was building a narrative where blocking the shortcut meant endangering children. Since that day, I've dedicated my time as HOA president to ensuring our community stays connected and safe, Diane continued, her voice warming with manufactured passion. And now we have a situation where one resident has decided to block access that benefits everyone. I've tried talking to Margaret. I've tried reasoning with her. But grief can cloud judgment, make us act in ways that hurt our community. There it was, the dig wrapped in sympathy. Poor Margaret, not thinking clearly because she's mourning, not rational, not reasonable, just a grieving widow making bad decisions. She called 3 residents to speak, each one prepared with statements about using the shortcut, each one emphasizing how long they'd relied on it, how much more convenient it made their lives. One woman even claimed her elderly mother used the route to avoid the busier highway. Safety and tradition and community spirit, all wrapped together in testimonials that sounded rehearsed because they probably were. Through it all, I sat quietly, didn't interrupt, didn't react. Let her build her case while I built my response in my head, organizing it the way I'd organized 30 years of lesson plans. Introduction, evidence, conclusion. Simple, clear, undeniable. When Diane finally paused and looked at me with that expression of practiced patience, I stood. Margaret, she said, voice dripping with false warmth. We'd like to hear your perspective. Help us understand why you felt this was necessary. I pulled Tom's journals from my bag, 3 of them, leather-bound, substantial. The room's attention shifted immediately. People leaned forward. Diane's smile flickered. My husband documented this issue for 8 months before he died, I said, my voice carrying to the back row without shouting. Teacher projection. He tried the polite approach first, signs requesting people respect private property. They were destroyed within days, repeatedly. I opened the first journal, read aloud with the same steady tone I'd used for Shakespeare and Steinbeck. May 3rd, found 3 new tire tracks across the back 40. A TV marks deep enough to damage young oaks we planted last fall. Signs are gone again. 4th set this month. The room was completely silent now. May 17th. I continued, turning pages. Approached HOA President Diane Hartley at community meeting. Explained the situation politely. She said I was making mountains out of molehills. Asked for documentation of legal easement she claims exists. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. I looked up, met Diane's eyes. That was over a year before Tom died. Did you get back to him, Diane? Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. I kept reading, entry after entry. Tom's careful documentation of destroyed signs, property damage, dismissive responses from the woman now sitting at the head table claiming she'd tried to reason with me, his frustration building, his request for legal documentation that never materialized, his growing certainty that something wasn't right. When I reached the entry about her cruel comment regarding his health, I read it slowly. She said maybe I should spend less time protecting dirt and more time protecting my health. She knows about the heart condition. The whole board knows from liability insurance disclosure. She knows, and she said it anyway. Someone in the audience gasped. I didn't look to see who. My husband died of a heart attack 3 days after writing that entry, I said quietly. I can't prove Diane's harassment contributed to his death, but I can prove she made his final months miserable. I can prove she dismissed his legitimate property rights concerns. And I can prove she never provided the legal documentation of the easement she kept claiming existed. Diane tried to interrupt. Tom was under stress, his medications. Don't, I said. And the single word cut through her explanation like scissors through paper. Don't you dare suggest my husband's mind wasn't sound. He was a civil engineer for 40 years. These journals are dated, cross-referenced with county records, and completely accurate. I pulled out a folder, held it up. I have his medical records, his doctor's notes about stress related to ongoing conflict with a neighbor, blood pressure readings that spiked after confrontations with you, evidence that your dismissiveness affected his health. The room erupted in murmurs. Diane's face flushed. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. That's when Kate Rivera stood up. I need to say something, she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. Tom Webb came to me 6 months before he died. He was frustrated and exhausted. He told me Diane kept dismissing his concerns about the access road, that she wouldn't provide legal documentation for the easement she claimed existed. Every head in the room turned toward her. I told him he was absolutely right, Kate continued. I told him Diane had no legal authority to demand access to his private property. I agreed with him completely. She paused, and I saw tears in her eyes. But I didn't speak up publicly. I didn't support him at board meetings. I was afraid of crossing Diane because I'd seen what she does to people who challenge her. And I'm ashamed of that. She looked directly at Diane. But when you implied at the last meeting that Tom's concerns weren't valid, that his mind wasn't sound, I knew it was a lie. He was sharp and clear and absolutely right about everything he documented. And Margaret is finishing what her husband started. That's not grief. That's loyalty. The room shifted. You could feel it, the way a classroom feels when students suddenly question the teacher's authority. Doubt creeping in, certainty cracking. Diane tried to regain control. This is all very emotional, but we need to focus on facts. The wall blocks access that's been traditional for— Show us the easement, I interrupted. The legal documentation you told Tom existed. Show us right now. Diane's mouth opened, closed. I don't have it here, obviously. That's not the point of this meeting. Then what is the point? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, this meeting is about you trying to bully me into removing a legally permitted structure from my private property you have no legal claim to. We're not bullying anyone, Diane said, voice tight. We're trying to maintain community standards, preserve access that benefits everyone. Benefits you mean, I said quietly. Because that shortcut isn't about community spirit. It's about money. Her face went pale, just for a second, just long enough for me to know I'd hit something real. I didn't elaborate, not yet, but I'd planted the seed, and seeds grow in silence. Diane called for a vote anyway. All in favor of requiring Margaret Webb to remove the obstruction and restore community access within 30 days? Hands went up. I counted. 35 for, 20 against, 7 abstaining. The numbers told me everything. She still had majority support, but it wasn't unanimous anymore. Doubt had entered the room, and it wouldn't leave easily. The motion passes, Diane announced, trying for authority. Margaret, you have 30 days to comply. I stood, gathering Tom's journals. This vote is theater. You have no legal authority over my property. But I appreciate you making your position clear. It'll be useful later. I walked out without waiting for a response. Behind me, the room exploded in conversation. I heard my name, heard Diane's voice rising to restore order. Didn't look back. Outside, Kate caught up with me in the parking lot. "That took courage," she said, standing up to her like that. "You're the one who showed courage," I replied, "speaking truth when you knew it might cost you." "I owed Tom that. I owe you that." She hesitated. "Be careful, Margaret. Diane doesn't lose gracefully." "Neither do I said. The next morning, I started the real work. The wall's foundation and vertical structure were complete, concrete cured and solid as the earth itself. Now came the part Tom had designed specifically, meticulously, the part that would make this more than just a barrier, the archive, the heart of everything. I worked alone at first, in the workshop Tom had built with his own hands 5 summers ago. The space still smelled like him somehow, a ghost scent of sawdust and machine oil, and the particular soap he'd used. His tools hung on pegboards in perfect order, each one outlined in black marker so you'd know where it belonged. His coffee mug sat on the workbench, permanently stained with rings from 1,000 mornings of working while the house still slept. His jacket hung on the hook by the door, faded denim with a tear in the elbow he'd never gotten around to mending. I hadn't changed anything. Couldn't bring myself to. The workshop was a museum to the man he'd been, and I was its only curator and visitor. The 5 document cases sat on the workbench like soldiers awaiting deployment, industrial-grade waterproof containers designed to survive fire and flood and the slow erosion of time. Each one would go into its designated chamber in the wall, sealed and protected according to specifications Tom had calculated with engineering precision. I'd been organizing the contents for weeks, sorting through papers and photographs and digital files, printing and copying and arranging. But now I approached it with fresh purpose, new understanding, not just documentation, legacy, making sure Tom's voice survived even if everything else failed, even if I failed, even if the world forgot us both. This was bigger than property rights now. This was about making sure a good man's fight mattered, about proving that truth could outlast lies if you built it strong enough. Chamber 1 got property documentation. I arranged each document with the precision I'd once used for lesson plans. Everything in order, everything indexed. The deed showing our names together, Thomas James Webb and Margaret Sullivan Webb, joint ownership with rights of survivorship. The survey maps with precise boundaries marked in red ink, corners verified by licensed surveyors, measurements down to the inch, county records showing no easement, no right-of-way, no encumbrance of any kind on the southern 40 acres. Letters from the county clerk, confirming what the map showed in language that left no room for interpretation. Permits for the wall, approved and filed and stamped with official seals that made them undeniable. Everything that proved my absolute legal right to build what I was building, to defend what was mine, to say no without apology or explanation. I wrote to Tom as I worked, in the journal I'd started keeping after his death. Letters he'd never read, but that I needed to write anyway. One-sided conversations that kept him present when absence threatened to swallow everything. "I'm following your blueprint exactly," I wrote in careful script at the top of a fresh page. "Every measurement, every specification. The chambers are positioned precisely where you marked them. You knew what I'd need. You knew what would come. You always saw 3 moves ahead while I was still figuring out the current one." Chamber 2 held Tom's journals. Not the originals, those stayed locked in my safe deposit box at the bank, protected by steel and lawyers and bank security. But complete copies, every page photographed in high resolution and printed on archival paper that would last 100 years without fading. Every entry that documented the problem, tracked the violations, recorded Diane's dismissals and deflections and outright lies. His handwriting filled page after page, small and precise. The hand of an engineer who'd spent 40 years turning ideas into blueprints into reality. I ran my fingers over the printed words, feeling the absence of indent, missing the 3-dimensional proof that his hand had touched this paper. But the words remained. That mattered more. "Your words are the foundation of everything," I wrote to him. "Your documentation is what makes this real instead of just my word against hers. You built a case even when you thought no one was listening, even when you thought you were fighting alone. But I'm listening now, Tom. Everyone will listen now. Chamber 3 contained evidence of violations that went beyond Tom's journals. Photographs of destroyed signs, each one tagged with precise date and GPS coordinates. 6 different signs, 18 instances of destruction over 14 months. I documented them all, photographing the broken posts, the torn materials, the deliberate vandalism, measurements of ATV damage. Tom had taken with engineering tools, showing ruts deep enough to kill young trees, to damage irrigation lines, to create erosion patterns across the lower pasture. Timeline of incidents spanning 18 months, color-coded by severity, cross-referenced with weather data and lunar phases, because Tom had wondered if there was a pattern to when violations occurred. Video footage from the trail camera I'd installed after the third set of signs disappeared. Hours of footage edited down to the critical moments. Vehicles crossing the property line, ATVs churning up grass, teenagers drinking beer and leaving cans scattered in the sagebrush. All of it dated, time-stamped, undeniable. Multiple vehicles meant multiple violators. Multiple violations meant a pattern. Pattern meant either institutional failure or institutional intent. Either way, it destroyed Diane's narrative of innocent traditional use. They thought they could hide it by destroying the signs, I wrote to Tom. Thought that eliminating evidence of boundary meant eliminating the boundary itself. They didn't know you were documenting everything with engineer's precision. They didn't know I would find your documentation and expand it. They didn't know I would finish what you started. The afternoon light slanted through the workshop windows, the same light Tom had worked by countless times. Dust motes drifted in the golden beams. Everything was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, the tick of the wall clock, the distant sound of wind in the oaks. I missed him so much it felt physical, an ache that settled in my chest and never quite left. But the work helped, gave the missing something to push against instead of just emptying out into nothing. Chamber 4 held communications with the HOA. Every email Tom had sent requesting information about the supposed easement, formatted and printed with headers showing dates and recipients. Every non-response or deflection from Diane, the silence speaking louder than words. Meeting minutes from the gathering where I'd raised the issue, Diane's dismissals recorded in dry bureaucratic language that couldn't hide the contempt underneath. The vote from tonight's meeting would go in here too once I got the official minutes. Documentation of institutional failure. Proof that doing things the right way, following proper channels, trusting the system, meant nothing when the system was controlled by someone with no interest in truth. You tried the proper channels, I wrote to Tom. You followed every rule they said mattered. You were professional and patient and reasonable. And they ignored you because they thought they could, because they thought you'd eventually give up or give in. They were wrong about you. They're wrong about me. Chamber 5 held what I'd discovered about motive, about the real reason Diane cared so much about a dirt road that saved drivers 3 minutes. The development proposal for Hartley Meadows that I'd found buried in County Planning Commission records. 38 luxury homes on 28 acres of land adjacent to mine, each home starting at $800,000 according to the preliminary marketing materials. The zoning variance application citing established community access infrastructure via traditional route as justification for road access exceptions. The commission structure showing Diane stood to make 6% of total project sales if it was approved, roughly $180,000 based on projected prices. Financial statements I'd pulled from public HOA records, available to anyone willing to spend hours sorting through uploaded PDFs on the county website. Payments to something called Community Development Consulting, LLC. $45,000 over 4 years, paid in irregular installments. Services never specified in meeting minutes. Work product never documented or presented to the board. A business registration search showed Community Development Consulting, LLC, was registered to one Diane Marie Hartley. Her maiden name, her shell company, her way of paying herself from HOA funds for services that existed only on paper. This was never about community, I wrote to Tom in letters that got larger, angrier, as emotion pushed through. It was never about tradition or convenience or neighborly cooperation. It was about money, about setting up a commission that would pay more than she makes in 3 years of real estate sales. She needed that shortcut to look established. To support her developer's variance application, she needed people using it regularly so she could document the pattern, prove it was traditional infrastructure. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going. Needed to get it all out before it burned a hole through my chest. That's why she encouraged the trespassing instead of stopping it. That's why she refused to acknowledge your complaints or provide documentation of an easement that never existed. You were threatening her payday, threatening her plan, and she made your last month's hell because of it. Because money mattered more than your peace, more than your health, more than your life. I had to stop writing then. Had to set the pen down and press my palms against my eyes until the tears stopped threatening. Grief and rage mixed together into something that had no name, but felt like steel forming under pressure. Tom had died fighting someone who saw him as an obstacle to profit. Had spent his final months stressed and sleepless and experiencing chest pain. Because a woman valued $180,000 more than basic human decency. That knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone, but it also sharpened everything into clarity. This wasn't just about defending property anymore. It was about making sure Tom's death mattered, making sure the fight he started exposed exactly what he'd been fighting against. I sealed each chamber with surgical precision, following Tom's specifications for waterproofing and protection that went beyond reasonable into obsessive. But Tom had never been reasonable about engineering. He'd been thorough, complete. Building things that would outlast him turned out to be prophecy instead of paranoia. By late afternoon, all 5 chambers were ready for installation. Rick showed up as I was carrying the first case out to the wall. "Need a hand?" "Always," I said. We worked together in the fading light, installing each chamber into its designated cavity in the wall structure. Tom's blueprint specified exact locations, depths, orientations. We followed it precisely. Each case slid into place, surrounded by additional weatherproofing, secured with mounting brackets that would hold them stable even if the wall shifted over decades. Rick saw the labels on the cases as we installed them: property records, personal documentation, violation evidence, HOA communications, financial analysis. He didn't ask what was inside, just helped me position them correctly, make sure everything was level and secure before we sealed the access panels. "Tom built this to last forever," Rick observed as we finished the final chamber. "He built it to outlast lies," I said. "Truth needs permanence. That's why the chambers are so protected. Not just from weather, but from attempts to destroy evidence." "Exactly." I ran my hand over the sealed panel, invisible now unless you knew where to look. "If anyone tries to breach these, my attorney gets notified automatically. Everything inside gets released to the county, the media, everyone who needs to know." Rick whistled low. "Dead man switch. Which? Smart." Tom's idea. He thought of everything. We stood back, looking at the completed wall in the gathering dusk. 40 feet long, 6 feet high at the peak, solid enough to stop a truck. And inside it, sealed in waterproof steel, every piece of evidence needed to prove what Diane Hartley had done. What she was still trying to do. "She came by this afternoon," Rick said quietly, "while you were at the hardware store. Took more photos, tried to examine the wall close up." "Did she touch it?" "Got close. I told her she was on private property. She said she was just documenting a public safety hazard." He paused. "She's not going to stop." "I know. What's your next move?" "Wait," I said. "Let her make hers. She'll escalate. They always do." Diane's next move came 48 hours later. A formal complaint filed with the county building inspector, alleging unpermitted modifications, structural hazards, and potential code violations. The notice arrived certified mail on Saturday morning. I called the inspector's office Monday and scheduled the inspection for Wednesday. Welcomed it. Invited witnesses to attend if they wanted. The more people who saw the wall was completely legal, the better. Wednesday arrived cool and clear. The inspector showed up at 10. A woman in her 40s named Sarah Chen, efficient and professional. She had my permits, the approved plans, Tom's original blueprint for comparison. Diane arrived 10 minutes later with an entourage, both male board members, Linda the treasurer looking increasingly uncomfortable, and 3 residents with cameras. Sarah Chen examined the wall methodically, checked measurements against permits, tested structural integrity with a geological hammer and electronic level, reviewed the reinforcement specifications, compared the finished product to approved plans. This is actually overbuilt for its stated purpose, she observed. The engineering is excellent, way more robust than necessary for a simple retaining wall and fence. My husband designed it, I said. He was a civil engineer. He believed in building things to last. Well, it'll last. Probably outlive the house. Sarah made notes on her tablet. Everything's in code. Permits are in order. The structure is sound and safe. Diane stepped forward. What about what's inside? She could be hiding anything in there. Chemicals, waste, dangerous materials. Sarah looked at her with the patience of someone dealing with unreasonable complaints all day. Ma'am, hollow core reinforced walls are a standard construction technique. There's nothing illegal about them. Unless you have specific evidence of hazardous materials, I can't demand she open sealed portions of a private structure on her private property. I demand you inspect what's inside, Diane insisted, for safety reasons. Do you have any evidence of a safety hazard? Sarah asked. Any readings showing contamination? Any specific reason to believe there's something dangerous? Diane's jaw clenched. I have a right to know what's on property adjacent to mine. Actually, you don't, Sarah said mildly. This is Ms. Webb's private property. The structure is permitted and safe. My inspection is complete. That's when I made my decision. I'd planned to wait, to let Diane keep escalating until she made a critical mistake. But the opportunity was too perfect. All these witnesses, the official inspection, the moment when I could show just enough to make her panic. I'm happy to show you what's inside one chamber, I said, just to demonstrate there's nothing dangerous. Diane's eyes lit with something like triumph. She thought she'd won, thought she'd forced my hand. I opened the access panel for Chamber 4, the one containing HOA communications. The seal broke with a soft hiss, and I pulled out the waterproof case, opened it in full view of everyone gathered. Inside were binders, labeled, organized, professional, just documentation. Sarah Chen looked through the first binder briefly. This is just file storage? Records and correspondence? Yes, fireproof archive, all legal. I pulled a specific document from the binder. A letter on HOA letterhead, dated 3 years earlier. Diane's signature at the bottom. This is interesting, I said, holding it up. A letter Diane wrote to the HOA board, warning about liability concerns from unauthorized ATV use on private property owners' land. I read aloud. The board should be aware that residents are regularly trespassing on property at the south boundary. This creates significant liability exposure for the HOA. If anyone is injured on land, we have no legal right to access. Recommend we advise residents to cease use of this route immediately. The silence was absolute. That's my land she's describing, I said. The same land she now claims has traditional community access. The same route she's demanding I keep open. I looked at Diane. You identified the exact liability risk you're now denying exists. You acknowledged the trespassing, in writing, 3 years ago. Diane's face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, fear. That's taken out of context. There were other considerations. Like your development deal? I asked quietly. Her face went white. I didn't elaborate, didn't reveal how much I knew about Riley Development or the commission she stood to make. Just let the implication hang in the air like smoke. I pulled another document from the binder. An email chain, obtained through public records request. Diane to Linda Chen, the treasurer. Subject, RE, liability concern letter. I read aloud. Linda, please file this in the miscellaneous correspondence folder and do not bring it up at the next board meeting. I'll handle the property owner situation through other channels. We don't want to create unnecessary alarm about liability when we're trying to maintain community access for the benefit of all residents. I looked at Linda. She'd gone pale, eyes wide. She'd been part of this, maybe not willingly, but complicit. You wrote back agreeing, I said gently. Not accusing, just stating fact. Because Diane is good at making people feel like they have no choice. Linda's eyes filled with tears. The inspector finished her notes. Ms. Webb, your wall is compliant, safe, and properly permitted. The documentation storage is legal. The complaint is unfounded. She looked at Diane. Ma'am, filing false complaints wastes county resources. I'd advise against it in the future. The crowd dispersed slowly after that, whispers spreading like wildfire. I saw neighbors on phones before they even reached their cars. The story would be all over the community by dinner. Diane stayed after everyone else left, standing 20 feet from the wall, staring at it like it had personally betrayed her. "You planned this," she said finally. "This whole performance, showing just enough to humiliate me." "I showed exactly what you demanded to see," I said. "Documentation, evidence, truth." "What else is in there?" "Everything," I said simply. "Everything you've tried to hide or deny or dismiss. Everything Tom documented before he died. Everything I've discovered since. All of it sealed and protected and ready to be released if you keep pushing." "You're blackmailing me." "I'm defending my property with evidence. There's a difference." I met her eyes. "You made my husband's final months hell. You dismissed his legitimate concerns. You contributed to stress that affected his health. And you did it all for money, for a development commission." "You can't prove that." "Chamber 5 says otherwise." I smiled, not friendly. "But you'll never know for sure what evidence I have unless you force me to release it all. Is your commission worth that risk?" She stared at me for a long moment, then got in her car without another word. I stood by the wall as she drove away, running my hand over the cool concrete. Inside these walls was truth Tom had gathered and I had expanded, protected, made permanent. Diane had made her move. She'd lost. But something told me she wasn't done yet. People like her never were. They couldn't tolerate losing because they couldn't tolerate being wrong. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. "Marcus? The inspection went well. Everything's documented. But I think you should activate the dead man switch protocols now. Full automation. If anything happens to me or the wall, everything gets released immediately." "You think she'll escalate to violence?" "I think she'll escalate to something," I said. "And I want to be ready when she does." That night, I wrote to Tom in my journal, sitting at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where he'd read the newspaper while I graded essays, where normal life had happened before death redefined everything. They saw the evidence today, not all of it. Just enough to know it exists, to know it's real, to know it's protected. Diane's letter was perfect. Her own words, her own signature, proving she knew the truth 3 years ago and has been lying about it ever since. The bureaucratic paper trail becoming her own noose. I wish you were here to see her face when I read it aloud. That moment when she realized her own documentation was going to be her downfall. The instant she understood that being meticulous about covering her tracks meant creating evidence of the cover-up itself. You would have appreciated the irony. You always loved when someone's cleverness became their undoing. The wall is everything you designed it to be. Not just a barrier between our property and their trespassing. A witness to what happened. A repository of truth that can't be dismissed or denied or destroyed without triggering consequences she can't control. Your voice, speaking through concrete and evidence and engineering that will outlast all of us. I miss you. I miss you every single day. Miss you in the morning when I still reach for your coffee cup out of habit. Miss you in the afternoon when I want to tell you about something I saw or read. Miss you at night when the bed is too big and the house is too quiet, and the absence is louder than any presence ever was. But finishing this, honoring your fight, completing what you started, it helps. It gives the grief purpose and direction. Gives the missing something to mean instead of just being empty space where you used to be. Whatever comes next, whatever Diane tries in her desperation, the truth is protected. You made sure of that with your planning, your foresight, your refusal to give up even when you were fighting alone. And I'm making sure your protection holds. Making sure your last project serves its purpose. I love you. I love you still and always and in ways that don't stop just because you're gone. And I'm finishing this for both of us, for the life we had, for the retirement we were supposed to share on this land, for the principle that truth matters and boundaries matter, and some fights are worth having even when they cost everything. She won't win. I promise you that. She won't win. I sealed the journal and put it in the safe with Tom's originals, tucking it beside the leather-bound books that held his last months in ink and pain and determination. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Diane's next move, the community's reaction, the slow, grinding machinery of consequence beginning to turn. But tonight, the wall stood solid against the darkness. The truth was safe inside steel and concrete. Tom's final project was complete down to the last specification, the last measurement, the last seal. Some battles you fight for yourself, for your own peace or pride or principle. Others you fight for people who can't fight anymore, for the ones who started something they didn't live to finish. Those battles matter differently, deeper, with weight that doesn't come from personal stake, but from love and loyalty and the stubborn refusal to let death be the end of someone's story. This one I was fighting for my husband, for Tom, for the engineer who'd seen the problem and designed the solution but died before he could build it. For the good man who'd been harassed into stress and sleepless nights and chest pain by someone who valued money more than basic human decency. And I was winning. Not because I was stronger or smarter or more ruthless than Diane, but because I had something she'd never understood and therefore never prepared for. The absolute certainty that comes from having nothing left to lose. The freedom that grief grants you when it takes away everything except the truth. The wall wasn't just concrete anymore. It was a promise kept, a truth preserved, and a boundary made absolutely clear. It was Tom's voice made permanent, his fight made visible, his death made meaningful. Diane Hartley had 60 days left on the HOA's bogus compliance deadline. 60 days she probably thought would pressure me into backing down, into compromising, into being reasonable the way women my age were supposed to be reasonable when authority figures told them no. But I had something better than deadlines, better than social pressure or institutional weight or the discomfort of being seen as difficult. I had evidence that couldn't be dismissed, patience that came from teaching teenagers for 30 years, a dead man's switch that would release everything if she got violent or stupid, and the kind of determination that only comes from grief transmuted into purpose. That combination made me more dangerous than Diane had ever imagined a grieving widow could be. More dangerous than she could prepare for or manipulate around or socially isolate into submission. The real war was just beginning. The midnight visits and desperate measures and final confrontations that would expose everything. But the first battle was mine, completely undeniably mine, and Tom would have been proud. Diane came for the wall at 2:47 in the morning on a Wednesday, wearing black yoga pants and carrying tools she'd clearly bought that afternoon because the price tags were still attached. White rectangles glowing in the infrared camera feed, like confession notes pinned to darkness. She thought darkness and determination would be enough, that wanting something badly enough made you invisible, made you clever, made rules stop applying to you the way they applied to other people. But she'd forgotten something crucial about the woman she was trying to outsmart. Teachers develop a sixth sense for deception after 3 decades of catching students who think they're the first ones clever enough to try cheating, the first ones to doctor a permission slip or plagiarize an essay or forge a parent's signature. I knew exactly what desperation looked like because I'd seen it on 1,000 teenage faces. The jerky movements that came from adrenaline fighting conscience. The constant checking over the shoulder that revealed guilt more clearly than any confession. The amateur's fundamental belief that darkness and intention were enough. That planning meant you'd thought of everything when really you'd only thought of the obvious things. And I'd been waiting for her. Not because I'd predicted she'd come at this exact hour on this exact night, but because I'd known with teacher certainty that she'd come eventually, that people like Diane Hartley don't accept defeat gracefully because they can't. Their entire sense of self is built on winning, on controlling outcomes, on bending reality to match their preferences through force of will and social pressure. When reality refuses to bend, when evidence can't be talked away and witnesses won't be silenced, they don't accept it. They try to break what they can't bend. The inspection had been 4 days ago. 4 days since her own letter had exposed her lies in front of witnesses and cameras and the county official, whose job it was to care about truth rather than social dynamics. 4 days since the county had declared my wall legal and her complaint frivolous and told her to stop wasting public resources on personal vendettas. 4 days since I'd opened one chamber and shown just enough evidence to make her understand, really understand, how much more I had sealed away in waterproof steel and Tom's meticulous documentation. 4 days of silence from her while the neighborhood buzzed with gossip and speculation like a kicked hornet's nest, people choosing sides and revising histories and suddenly remembering things they'd overlooked when Diane held power. I'd known the silence meant she was planning something. Diane didn't go quiet when she gave up. She went quiet when she was calculating, strategizing, preparing her next move with the kind of focus that came from having everything at stake. People who've built kingdoms on sand don't walk away when the tide comes in. They try to hold back the ocean with their bare hands. Those 4 days had been strange ones. The neighborhood divided along fault lines that had probably always existed, but never showed until pressure made them visible. Some people still defended Diane, insisted there had to be another explanation, that surely she wouldn't lie about something so easily disproven. Others, the ones who'd been quietly suffering under her rule for years, started speaking up, started sharing stories, started connecting dots they'd kept separate out of fear or habit or learned helplessness. Kate Rivera had called me the morning after the inspection, voice shaking with something between excitement and terror. "Linda Chen came to my house last night, the treasurer. She needs to talk to you soon." We'd met at a coffee shop 20 minutes outside the neighborhood, neutral territory where Diane's social network didn't reach. Linda had looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen her. Exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes and mouth. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said without preamble, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. The lying, the covering, the pretending everything's fine when I know it isn't. She'd looked at me with something like desperation. "You showed that letter at the inspection, the one where Diane warned about liability. I found the email thread last night, the one where she told me to bury it. I'd forgotten, or maybe I made myself forget, but it's there, time-stamped, proof she was manipulating the record even then." "Will you testify to that if needed?" I'd asked. Linda's hands had trembled. "If I do, she'll destroy me. She knows things about a mistake I made with the books 5 years ago. Nothing criminal, just sloppy accounting I fixed immediately. But she could make it look bad, could ruin my reputation." I'd recognized the pattern, the same one Tom had documented. The way Diane kept people compliant through fear, through knowledge of small mistakes or vulnerabilities that became ammunition when needed. Rule through leverage instead of respect. "She's already destroying you," I'd said gently. "She's making you complicit in fraud, making you betray your own integrity to protect hers. That's not power. That's parasitism." Linda had started crying then, quiet tears that spoke of years of compromise and rationalization finally breaking down. "I have grandchildren, a reputation in this community. If people think I was part of stealing HOA funds, then tell the truth before someone else tells it for you," I'd said. "The audit is coming, you know it is. Better to be the whistleblower than the accomplice." She'd left without committing either way, but I'd seen the shift in her eyes, the moment when fear of consequences became less powerful than exhaustion from carrying lies. The next day, an anonymous email had arrived in my inbox. Subject line, "You should know the whole story." No signature, but I'd recognized the writing style from HOA minutes Linda had composed. The email contained attachments: development proposal for Hartley Meadows, complete with detailed financials I hadn't been able to access through public records. 38 homes, average price $850,000, total project value just over $32 million. Diane's commission structure, 6% of total sales, paid in installments as homes closed. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the contingency clause buried in the contract. If the project failed to receive necessary zoning variances within 18 months of proposal submission, Diane would forfeit all commissions and owe the developer $50,000 in penalties for misrepresentation of community support. She hadn't just been working for a commission. She'd been working against a debt, a penalty that would devastate her financially if the project collapsed. No wonder she'd been so desperate to maintain that shortcut, to document its use, to cultivate the pattern that supported the variance application. She wasn't just losing future income, she was facing a bill she couldn't pay. A second attachment showed the variance application status. Pending review, scheduled for County Planning Commission hearing in 6 weeks. The application cited established community access route, providing secondary road infrastructure, as key justification for waiving standard road access requirements. My property, my shortcut. My refusal to cooperate had put the entire variance in jeopardy. Diane wasn't just fighting for money anymore. She was fighting against financial ruin. The third attachment was the one that made my hands shake. An email from Jackson Riley, the developer, to Diane, sent 3 months ago, before Tom died. "Diane, we have a problem with the web property owner. He's documented trespass and is threatening legal action. This could undermine our variance application if he files complaints with the county before our hearing. You assured me community access was established and uncontested. Handle this situation immediately or I'll need to reconsider our partnership structure. Tom had been a problem, an obstacle, a threat to Diane's financial survival. And she'd handled it by dismissing him, by harassing him, by making his life miserable in hopes he'd give up or give in before dying complicated everything. Except he'd died, and she'd thought that would be the end of it. Thought the widow would sell or stay quiet or be manageable. She'd been catastrophically wrong. I'd printed everything, added it to Chamber 5's documentation, updated the digital backups. Then I'd forwarded the emails to my attorney with instructions to include them in the automatic release if anything happened to me or the wall. Diane wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting time and debt and consequences she'd set in motion years ago. That's what made her dangerous. People fighting for profit can be reasoned with. People fighting against ruin are unpredictable. The third day after the inspection, Kate had organized what she called a concerned residents meeting at her house. 12 women showed up, ranging in age from mid-30s to early 70s. I'd recognized most of them from neighborhood events, though I'd never spoken to them beyond polite hellos. They'd each brought stories, small ones mostly. HOA violations for infractions no one else got cited for. Fines that appeared without warning. Requests for variance denied without explanation, while Diane's friends got approvals rubber stamped. A pattern of selective enforcement that made everyone feel vulnerable, made everyone careful about crossing her. I complained about her son's friends parking in front of my mailbox, one woman had said. The next month, I got cited for having my trash cans visible from the street 1 hour past collection time. I'd been doing that for 3 years without issue. She knew my ex-husband was behind on child support, another woman shared. Mentioned it casually at a board meeting, just in passing, like she was concerned about my welfare. But everyone knew afterward. My private business became public knowledge. Story after story. Small cruelties disguised as community leadership. Power wielded through fear and shame instead of service. Why didn't anyone say anything before? I'd asked. Kate had answered. Because she made each of us think we were the only one. That's what bullies do, isolate their targets. Make them think no one else would believe them. Make them think speaking up would just make things worse. I'd recognized the pattern. The same dynamic I'd seen in high school hallways for 30 years. The way power perpetuated itself through silence, through making victims believe they deserved their treatment or that resistance was futile. She's facing criminal charges now, I'd said, for trespassing and attempted vandalism. The board is going to have to act. But what about the development? Someone had asked. If it goes through, all our property values increase. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to tear her down. And there it was, the rationalization, the willingness to overlook abuse if it came with profit. The development was built on fraud, I'd said quietly, on stolen HOA funds and manufactured evidence of community support. If that's how it starts, how do you think it ends? The room had gone silent. People staring at their hands or their coffee cups, wrestling with the choice between principle and profit. My husband fought her for 8 months before he died, I'd continued, documented every violation, every dismissal, every refusal to provide legal evidence for claims she made. He died stressed and sleep-deprived, and experiencing chest pain she mocked him for being concerned about. I can't prove she killed him, but I can prove she made his dying harder. And I won't pretend that's acceptable just because she promised us money. The meeting had ended without consensus, but with cracks in the unified support Diane had counted on. People left divided, uncertain, starting to question narratives they'd accepted without examination. That had been yesterday. And last night, I'd known something was coming. Could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, that shift in air pressure that means a storm approaching. So I'd prepared mine. The security system Tom had sketched in his blueprint wasn't just cameras. It was layered defense, the kind of thinking that came from 40 years of engineering projects where failure meant people got hurt, motion sensors at 3 perimeters, thermal imaging that saw body heat through darkness, audio pickups sensitive enough to catch whispers at 50 feet, silent alarms that buzzed my phone without making a sound on the property, and lighting, floods powerful enough to turn night into noon, positioned to blind anyone approaching the wall from the most likely angles. Tom had thought of everything, even the things he'd hoped would never be necessary. The first alert came at 2:38. Motion detected at the eastern property line, the spot where the old fire road met the fence. I was already awake, sitting in the darkened living room with coffee and Tom's journal, the one where he documented his final months. Rereading his words had become a ritual on nights when sleep felt impossible and the house felt too empty. I set down the journal and picked up my phone. The screen showed thermal imaging, a human-shaped blob of red and yellow moving slowly through the trees. Cautious, staying low, trying for stealth. I watched the figure pause at the fence line, look around, then climb over. Trespassing, documented, time-stamped. I didn't call 911 yet. Not until I had more than just trespassing, not until intent became action became crime. The figure moved toward the wall, stopping every few steps to check the surroundings. Even through thermal imaging, I could read the body language. Nervous, but committed. Scared, but desperate. The particular combination that makes people do stupid things they'll regret in the morning. I switched to infrared visible spectrum. The figure resolved into Diane Hartley, dressed in black athletic wear that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill, hair pulled back tight, face grim with determination. She carried a bag over one shoulder that clinked softly with each step. Tools. She'd brought tools. I pulled up the recording function on the security system, made sure all cameras were capturing, and settled in to watch. Sometimes the best thing you can do is give someone enough rope and then document carefully while they hang themselves with it. Diane reached the wall and stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. Her hand reached out, touched the concrete, traced along the surface like she was searching for something. Weakness, maybe. A flaw in Tom's engineering. Some way to undo what couldn't be undone. She wouldn't find it. Tom had built for permanence. After a minute, she unslung her bag and started pulling out tools. A pry bar first, matte black, new enough that I could see the price sticker glinting. Then a hammer, then something that looked like a chisel. An amateur's idea of what you'd need to breach a concrete wall. She had no idea how thoroughly inadequate her hardware store purchases were against the structure Tom had designed. The wall wasn't just concrete. It was reinforced with steel rebar in a grid pattern engineered to distribute stress. The chambers weren't accessible from outside without heavy equipment and time. You couldn't just pry your way in with hand tools bought on impulse. But watching her try would be instructive. Diane approached the section of wall where I'd opened the chamber during the inspection. Smart in a way. She knew that panel existed, knew it could be accessed. She just didn't know about the security features Tom had built in. She wedged the pry bar into the seam where the access panel met the wall, levered against it. The tool slipped, scraped against concrete, made a sound like a gunshot in the quiet night. She froze, listening. I watched her on 3 different camera angles, recording from multiple positions, building the kind of documentation that would be undeniable in court. She tried again. Got the pry bar seated better this time. Put her weight against it. The panel didn't move. Tom had designed it to withstand exactly this kind of attack. Tamper-resistant wasn't just a phrase on the blueprint. It was engineering reality. Diane's frustration showed in her body language, the tense shoulders, the sharp movements. She was muttering to herself, and the audio pickups caught fragments. Just open, have to see, can't let her. She switched tools, tried the chisel and hammer, attempting to chip away at the concrete around the panel. The hammer blows rang out across the property, sharp percussion in the night silence. She was being loud now, caution abandoned for desperation. That's when I knew she wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't thinking like someone worried about getting caught. She was thinking like someone who believed she had no choice, that this was her only option, that getting caught was less terrible than leaving that evidence sealed and protected. Desperation makes people sloppy. I'd seen it in students who plagiarized. The ones who got away with it were careful, methodical. The ones who got caught were desperate, rushing, making mistakes because panic overrode judgment. Diane was panicking. I gave her 5 more minutes. Let her chisel and pry and exhaust herself against concrete that wouldn't yield. Let her incriminate herself thoroughly with documented attempts at vandalism and evidence tampering. Let her cross every line that would matter when this ended up in front of a judge. Then I triggered the floodlights. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Darkness became daylight in the space between heartbeats. 6 floods mounted on poles Tom had positioned specifically for this scenario, all firing at once, all aimed to create overlapping fields that eliminated shadows and blinded anyone at the wall. Diane screamed. Not a word, just sound, raw and shocked and terrified. She stumbled backward, with hands flying up to shield her eyes, dropping the hammer. It hit concrete and bounced, the sound sharp and final. She spun around, squinting against the light, trying to see where it came from, how to escape it. But the floods were positioned to make the wall the brightest spot on the property, and everything beyond it invisible darkness. She couldn't see the house, couldn't see me, could only see light and wall, and her own shadow cast stark against concrete. I stepped out onto the porch, staying in the darkness beyond the flood reach, and spoke clearly. "Hello, Diane." She spun toward my voice, still blinded, still disoriented. I heard sounds. Thought someone was vandalizing." The lie came automatically, reflexive. The kind of thing people say when caught because admitting truth feels more dangerous than doubling down on obvious fiction. I held up my phone, made sure she could see the glow of the screen even if she couldn't see what was on it. "I have video of the last 15 minutes, all of it. You climbing the fence, walking to the wall, using tools to try to breach the access panel. All recorded, time-stamped, from multiple angles." Her mouth opened, closed. Her face cycled through expressions too fast to categorize. Shock, calculation, fear, defiance, back to fear. "You don't understand," she said. And her voice had changed completely. The authority was gone. The practiced confidence. What remained was raw and desperate and almost human. "That wall has to come down, it has to. Everything I've worked for, She didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Because finishing meant admitting what we both knew. "Everything you've worked for was built on lies," I said. "On ignoring property rights, on harassment, on using HOA funds for personal profit. The wall doesn't have to come down. Your kingdom does." Something broke in her then. I saw it happen. Saw the exact moment when denial became acknowledgement. Her shoulders sagged. Her hands dropped to her sides. She looked at the wall and then at me, and I saw tears on her face. Real ones. Not performative grief, but actual despair. "You don't know what it's like," she said, voice shaking. "Working for years to put together something that could set me up for retirement, real retirement. Not scraping by on Social Security. The commission from Hartley Meadows would have been everything. So you made my husband's life hell for money. I didn't mean Tom wasn't supposed to. He was just being stubborn about nothing. A stupid dirt road, 3 minutes of driving time. It wasn't worth fighting over." The casual dismissal of Tom's suffering, of his documented stress and sleepless nights and chest pain, hit me like a physical blow. She still didn't understand. Still saw it as Tom being unreasonable, rather than her being predatory. "It was his property," I said, and my voice came out colder than I'd intended. Harder. "You had no right to it. No legal claim, no moral authority, just greed and a willingness to hurt people who got in your way." "I never hurt anyone." The defiance flared back, automatic denial overriding evidence. "Your husband had a bad heart. That wasn't my fault. You told him to spend less time protecting his health the week before he died. You knew he had a heart condition. You knew stress was dangerous for him. And you kept pushing anyway because money mattered more than his life." She backed away from me, shaking her head. "That's not... I didn't kill him. His heart killed him. His heart failed while he was fighting you. While you were dismissing his legitimate concerns and making him feel like he was crazy for defending basic property rights. You didn't pull a trigger, but you contributed to his death, and we both know it." The words hung in the night air between us. Accusation and truth mixed so thoroughly they couldn't be separated. That's when I heard the sirens. Diane heard them too. Her head snapped toward the sound, eyes going wide. "You called the police?" "I called them when you started trying to breach the wall with a hammer. That's attempted vandalism, destruction of evidence, trespassing, criminal damage to property, take your pick." 2 sheriff's vehicles came up the drive. No lights now, but sirens still wailing, deliberately loud, making sure everyone within half a mile knew something was happening. Diane looked from them to me to the wall, and I saw calculation in her eyes. Saw her considering running. "Don't," I said. "You'll just make it worse." She didn't run, just stood there in the floodlights like an actress on stage waiting for her cue. Except this performance had only one ending. The deputies emerged from their vehicles, professional and calm. the way cops move when they're responding to a call that isn't life or death but still requires their presence. The lead deputy, a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back tight, approached slowly. "Ma'am, are you the homeowner?" "I am," I said. "Margaret Webb. I called about someone attempting to vandalize my property." The deputy looked at Diane, taking in the black clothes, the tools scattered on the ground, the guilty desperation written across her face. "And you are?" "Diane Hartley. I'm the HOA president. There were sounds. I thought someone was damaging property. I was trying to help." The lie sounded thin even to her own ears. The deputy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition of bullshit, maybe. The look cops develop after years of hearing people explain why they're not really doing what they're obviously doing. "At 2 in the morning?" the deputy asked. "In black clothes, with tools?" Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I handed the deputy my phone, the security footage queued up and ready. "This is the last 20 minutes, time-stamped, multiple angles, shows her climbing my fence, approaching the wall, attempting to pry open a sealed access panel." The deputy watched the footage in silence, scrolling through different camera angles. Her partner, a younger male deputy, moved to examine the wall, the scattered tools, the fresh marks where Diane's chisel had scraped concrete. "Ms. Hartley," the lead deputy said, and her voice had shifted from neutral to official. "I need you to step away from the wall and place your hands where I can see them." "This is ridiculous," Diane said, but she was crying now, tears streaming down her face, makeup running in dark streaks. "She's the one who's been hostile. She's the one blocking community access. I was just trying to verify that she wasn't hiding something dangerous in that wall. By committing criminal trespass and vandalism at 3 in the morning?" The deputy's voice held no sympathy. "Ma'am, I need you to place your hands behind your back." That's when Diane completely unraveled. "You don't understand. The development is approved. The variance just needs the access documentation. If she blocks that road, the whole project falls apart and I lose everything." The confession spilled out uncontrolled, words tumbling over each other, the desperate need to make someone understand overriding basic self-preservation. She told them about the commission, about the developer needing documented community access, about the variance application pending county approval, about everything she'd done to cultivate use of the shortcut to establish the pattern. The deputies exchanged glances. The younger one was recording on his body camera, capturing every word. "So you were attempting to destroy evidence that would undermine your financial interest in a development project?" the lead deputy asked, her voice careful and clear, making sure the body camera caught the question and answer both. Diane realized too late what she'd said. Her mouth snapped shut, but the damage was done. They arrested her there, under the floodlights, reading her rights while she alternated between silence and outbursts, charged her with criminal trespass, attempted vandalism, attempted destruction of evidence, cuffed her hands behind her back, and walked her to the patrol car while she kept looking back at the wall like it had personally betrayed her. Maybe in her mind it had. She'd built her whole scheme on the assumption that the shortcut would remain accessible, that no one would challenge her authority, that widows were manageable and engineers died before finishing their projects. She'd been wrong on every count. As the patrol car pulled away, red and blue lights painting the darkness, the second deputy approached me. "You'll need to come to the station in the morning to give a full statement. Bring copies of all your security footage." "I will," I said. "Thank you for responding so quickly." He nodded, started to leave, then paused. "That wall, your husband design it?" "Yes. How did you know?" "The engineering. It's overbuilt for a simple barrier, but perfect for exactly what just happened." He looked at it with something like appreciation. "Smart man." "He was," I said. "He really was." After the deputies left, I stood alone in the floodlights looking at the wall, at the fresh scrape marks where Diane's tools had failed against Tom's engineering, at the scattered equipment she'd abandoned in her panic, at the concrete holding firm exactly as designed. Tom had known this might happen, had prepared for someone trying to destroy the evidence by force, had built protections into the structure that would defeat amateur attempts and trigger consequences for professional ones. He'd been 3 steps ahead even after death. I gathered Diane's tools and bagged them as evidence, photographed everything, documented the damage attempts. By the time I finished, it was after 4 in the morning and the adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Inside the house, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Tom's journal. The entry about Diane telling him to worry less about his health seemed to glow on the page, his handwriting shaking slightly in a way it hadn't in earlier entries. He'd been dying, and she'd mocked him for being concerned about it, had used his vulnerability as a weapon, and tonight she'd confessed it all on body camera footage that would be part of the permanent record. Tom would have appreciated the poetry of that, the way truth had a gravity that eventually pulled everything into its orbit. I wrote to him in my own journal. She came for the wall tonight, just like you knew someone would, tried to pry it open with hardware store tools and desperation. The floodlights worked perfectly. The cameras captured everything. She confessed to it all in front of deputies. Your engineering held. Your preparation paid off. Your 3 steps ahead thinking caught someone who thought they were being clever. The wall isn't just standing anymore. It's proven, battle-tested. She threw everything she had at it and it didn't budge. Just like you. You faced her harassment for months and never backed down, never compromised on truth, never traded principle for peace. I understand now why you built it this way. Not just to keep evidence safe, but to prove it couldn't be destroyed. To show that truth, properly protected, is stronger than lies. She's arrested. The confession is recorded. The development deal is exposed. Everything you documented is validated. We won, Tom. Your wall won. Truth won. I wish you were here to see it, but maybe you are. Maybe you've been here all along, in the blueprint and the engineering, and the foresight that made this moment possible. I love you, and I'm so proud to finish what you started. Dawn came slowly, gray light bleeding into the sky like watercolor on wet paper. I watched it from the porch, coffee cold in my hands, exhausted but unable to sleep. The neighborhood woke to gossip traveling at the speed of text message. I saw it happen in real time. Lights turning on in houses, cars pulling out of driveways and gathering in clusters at the end of streets, people checking their phones and making calls and driving past my property slowly to see the scene. By 8 in the morning, Kate Rivera was at my door with fresh coffee and worried eyes. Everyone's talking about last night, she said. Is it true? Diane was arrested? I let her in, gave her the short version. Watched her face cycle through shock and vindication and something like grief. I knew she was desperate, Kate said quietly. But I didn't think she'd go that far. Criminal vandalism at your home, at night. People do extreme things when they're cornered. The whole neighborhood is in chaos. Half of them can't believe Diane would do something like this. The other half are saying they knew she was corrupt all along. Kate shook her head. Linda called an emergency board meeting for tonight. Without Diane. They're voting to suspend her as president. About time. There's more. Kate hesitated. Someone leaked the development proposal online. The one showing Diane's commission. It's all over the neighborhood message boards. People are furious about the HOA funds going to her consulting company. I hadn't leaked it, but I wasn't sorry someone had. Truth has a way of spreading once it starts, I said. The emergency board meeting that evening was standing room only. I didn't attend, didn't need to. The board voted unanimously to suspend Diane pending investigation into financial irregularities, appointed Kate as interim president, authorized a full forensic audit of HOA finances. Riley Development issued a statement the next day withdrawing the Hartley Meadows proposal, citing unforeseen complications. The variance application was pulled from county review. The project was dead. Diane's $180,000 commission evaporated like morning mist, and my wall stood untouched, undamaged, exactly as Tom had designed it. A witness to everything. A repository of truth that had proven it couldn't be destroyed by tools or desperation or lies. The community fracture that had started at the inspection widened into a canyon over the next week. People chose sides with the fervor of sports fans. Except the stakes were real, and the losing side faced actual consequences. Diane's defenders became quieter each day, their certainty eroding under the weight of arrest records and security footage, and her own recorded confession played back in living rooms and forwarded through email chains. The ones who'd supported me from the beginning became vocal in ways they hadn't been before. Started asking questions about other HOA decisions made over Diane's tenure. Other convenient explanations. Other times she'd claimed community interest while serving her own. The audit that Kate authorized revealed layers of irregularities beyond the consulting company payments. Expense reimbursements for conferences that didn't exist. Vendor contracts awarded to companies owned by Diane's relatives. landscaping bills for work that had never been performed, paid to Diane's brother-in-law who'd been dead for 2 years. The fraud went deeper than anyone had realized because no one had looked. People don't audit what they trust, and Diane had built her authority on making people trust her competence, even when they disliked her methods. Within a week, 2 more board members resigned. Linda Chen submitted a detailed letter accepting responsibility for her oversight failures and offering to cooperate fully with investigations. The letter read like confession and penance mixed together. Someone finally choosing integrity over comfort, even when it cost. Riley Development issued a statement that was a masterpiece of corporate deflection. Riley Development Group was unaware of any financial improprieties on the part of third-party consultants and has withdrawn all pending applications in the affected jurisdiction pending internal review. Translation: Diane was on her own, Riley was protecting itself, and the $180,000 commission plus the $50,000 penalty clause were both now her problem. The developer had abandoned her faster than anyone thought possible. No loyalty, no partnership, just business protecting business while individuals absorbed consequences. And through it all, the wall stood. Silent witness, permanent truth. Tom's final engineering project doing exactly what he designed it to do. Protecting evidence, exposing lies, making sure that boundaries, once properly defended, held against everything thrown at them. But something nagged at me in the quiet hours after the arrest. A detail I couldn't quite place. A connection my mind kept circling without landing on. The morning after Diane's arrest, I went back to Tom's workshop. His space, his tools, his presence preserved in dust and forgotten coffee cups and the smell of sawdust that wouldn't fade. I'd been avoiding a thorough search because it felt like trespassing, like violating his privacy even though death had already violated everything. But something had been bothering me about the timeline, about Tom's final months, about the way his research into the HOA issues had accelerated in those last weeks before his heart gave out. I started with his desk, methodical, drawer by drawer. Most of it was what I'd expected. Equipment manuals, sketches for projects never started, warranties for tools bought decades ago. But in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a folder of receipts, I found a small notebook I'd never seen before. It was newer than his engineering journals, spiral-bound, unlabeled. I opened it with hands that shook slightly. Tom's handwriting filled the pages, but different than his usual neat engineering script. This was hurried, urgent. Notes and observations and questions written by someone running out of time and knowing it. The first entry was dated 2 months before his death. Something's not right with the HOA finances. Diane's too defensive when asked about the consulting fees. Board too nervous when the topic comes up. Asked Linda for budget breakdown. She made excuses. Will request public records directly. Next entry, a week later. Public records show payments to Community Development Consulting, LLC. Secretary of State database shows Diane as registered agent. She's paying herself from HOA funds. How long has this been happening? Need to compile full history. Another week. Found the development proposal, Hartley Meadows. Diane stands to make a fortune. The shortcut across our property is key to the variance application. That's why she won't acknowledge my complaints. That's why she keeps dismissing property rights concerns. I'm threatening her payday. My chest tightened reading his words. Tom had figured it all out, had connected every dot weeks before he died. And he'd been doing it alone while I'd been lost in my own world of lesson plans and parent conferences. The entries continued, each one more urgent than the last. Tried to talk to board member Harris. He shut me down immediately. Said I was overcomplicating things. Felt threatened. This goes deeper than just Diane. Margaret had a rough day with the Anderson parent complaint. Didn't tell her about any of this. She has enough stress. Will handle it myself. Chest felt tight again today after another run-in with Diane. Called doctor's office, but they're booked for 2 weeks. We'll take aspirin and monitor. Can't tell Margaret. She worries too much already. I had to stop reading. Had to press my palms against my eyes until the tears stopped threatening. Tom protecting me right up until the end. Carrying the burden alone because he thought I couldn't handle more stress. Not knowing that I would have gladly shared it. Gladly fought beside him. Gladly taken half the weight if only he'd asked. But he'd been raised in a generation that believed protecting your spouse meant shielding them from problems. That being a good husband meant handling things yourself. The same belief that probably stopped him from insisting on that earlier doctor's appointment, from telling me about the chest pain, from admitting he needed help. The final entry was dated 3 days before he died. Confronted Diane directly today. Told her I knew about the development deal, about the self-dealing with HOA funds, about the variance application depending on my property. She denied everything at first, then got angry. Said I was paranoid. Said the medications I'm on for my heart must be affecting my thinking. Insulted my competence. Insulted my judgment. Then said maybe I should focus less on conspiracy theories and more on my health. She knows about the heart condition. The whole board knows from the insurance paperwork. She used it as a weapon, mocked me for having the weakness to worry about it. Couldn't sleep last night. Chest pain bad enough I almost went to ER. Didn't want to alarm Margaret. She has the department budget meeting today. We'll call Dr. Morrison in the morning. Schedule whatever tests they want. Can't let stress affect my health any more than it already has. But first need to document everything. Build the wall, seal the evidence, make sure the truth survives even if I don't. Margaret will need proof. Will need protection from people who see kindness as weakness and grief as opportunity. The blueprint is complete, the design is sound. Just need to explain it to her when the time is right. The entry ended there. 3 days later, his heart had stopped beating in the garden while I was teaching Romeo and Juliet to sophomores who didn't care about doomed lovers. He'd known he was in danger, had documented it, had tried to protect me one final time by building a solution I could use after he was gone. And I'd been too distracted to notice any of it. The guilt threatened to crush me. But beneath the guilt was something harder and clearer. Absolute certainty that Diane Hartley had contributed to my husband's death in ways that went beyond legal culpability into moral damnation. She'd used his health vulnerability as a weapon, had mocked him for being concerned about stress affecting his heart, had escalated conflict when she knew it was literally dangerous to him. Maybe she hadn't meant for him to die. Maybe she just meant to intimidate him into silence. But intent didn't change outcome, didn't bring him back, didn't erase the chest pain he'd suffered alone rather than worry me. I added Tom's secret notebook to the archive materials, made copies for my attorney, photographed every page. This was the evidence I'd been missing. The direct connection between Diane's harassment and Tom's declining health. His own words documenting the stress, the chest pain, the sleepless nights. Not legal proof of causation, but moral proof that her cruelty had consequences she'd never be charged for. That night, I wrote to Tom with anger that shook my handwriting. I found your notebook, the one where you tracked everything in those final weeks. I know now that you understood it all. The fraud, the development deal, the reason she wouldn't stop. I know you were protecting me, carrying the weight alone because you thought I couldn't handle more stress. And I'm angry about that, Tom. Angry that you didn't trust me to be strong enough. Angry that you died keeping secrets meant to shield me. But I'm angrier at her, at Diane, at the woman who used your health as a weapon against you, who mocked you for being concerned about stress when stress was literally killing you. She'll never be charged for that. Never face legal consequences for using your vulnerability to intimidate you. But she'll face something, because your notebook is now part of the archive, part of the permanent record, part of the truth that can't be buried. Everyone will know what she did, how she treated a good man in his final months, how she valued money more than human decency. That's not legal justice, but it's something. I love you, I miss you, and I'm finishing this fight with everything you gave me. The wall stood in the darkness outside my window, concrete and steel, and Tom's foresight made permanent. Inside it, 5 chambers held truth that would outlast all of us. Truth about property rights and HOA corruption and harassment, and a good man's fight against someone who confused authority with immunity. Diane was out on bail, facing criminal charges, her reputation shattered, and her development deal collapsed. But I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. People who'd built entire identities on control don't surrender easily. They escalate, they lash out, they make desperate moves that only make things worse. The midnight attempt on the wall had been desperation. What came next would be something darker. But I was ready. The wall was ready. And truth, properly protected, could wait as long as necessary. Because some promises transcend death. Some fights continue beyond the grave. And some boundaries, once properly defended, hold against everything the world throws at them. Tom had built that wall knowing he might not live to see it completed. But he'd built it anyway. Because some truths matter more than personal survival. Some legacies are worth creating, even when you won't be there to witness them. I was his legacy now, his voice, his fight continued, and I wouldn't stop until every truth Tom had documented was acknowledged. Every lie Diane had told was exposed, and every person who thought they could dismiss a good man's concerns faced exactly what he'd been preparing for. The real war was coming, but I'd already won the battles that mattered. Truth was protected, evidence was sealed, and nothing Diane could do would change that now. The wall stood witness, and witnesses, properly protected, tell their stories forever. They say grief comes in waves. What they don't tell you is that sometimes those waves carry you toward shore instead of pulling you under, that sometimes the undertow becomes the current that moves you forward. 3 days after Diane's arrest, her son Drew called me from California. His voice on the phone was young and uncertain, and carrying weight no voice that age should have to carry. "Mrs. Webb, this is Drew Hartley, Diane's son." A pause, breathing, gathering courage. "I need to tell you the truth about my accident, the one my mother's been using to justify everything." I sat down at the kitchen table, Tom's journal open in front of me, and listened to a 29-year-old man confess to a lie he'd been carrying since he was 14. "There was no accident," Drew said, words coming faster now like a dam breaking. "I mean, there was, but not the way she tells it. I fell off my bike going too fast around a corner, scraped my arm on gravel. That's it. No hospital, no emergency room, just urgent care for a bandage and tetanus shot." "But your mother filed an insurance claim," I said, already knowing the answer. $8,000. She took pictures of the scrape from every angle, had the urgent care doctor documented extensively, told him I'd hit my head even though I hadn't, coached me on what to say if anyone asked. I was 14. I didn't know it was fraud. I just knew Mom was really insistent about getting it documented properly. His voice cracked. "She's been using that story for 7 years, talking about how dangerous that road is, how children get hurt, how important safe access is. But it was just a scraped arm from me being a stupid kid on a bike, and she turned it into this whole thing." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "Because she taught me that truth matters, that integrity matters, that standing up for what's right is more important than what's convenient." He laughed, bitter and hurt. "She taught me all that, and then did the opposite. And I can't let her use me as an excuse anymore. Not after what happened to your husband." The words hit harder than I'd expected. "What do you know about what happened to Tom?" "I know she harassed him for months. I know she dismissed his property rights because they got in the way of her deal. I know Dad left her partly because he saw what she was becoming and couldn't stop it." Drew's voice steadied, found conviction. "I know she's done things that were wrong, and I'm done being part of the lie." We talked for 20 minutes. He told me about his parents' divorce, about his father discovering Diane's financial irregularities years ago and trying to intervene, about choosing his mother's side because he'd been young and she'd been convincing, and sons want to believe their mothers are good people. "I'll testify," he said before hanging up. "If you need me, if it comes to trial. I'll tell the truth about the accident, about the insurance fraud, about everything I know. She's my mother and I love her. But what she did was wrong, and your husband deserved better than what she gave him." After we disconnected, I sat in the quiet kitchen holding the phone and thinking about the courage it took to testify against your own mother, about the kind of integrity that chose truth over family loyalty, about how Drew Hartley was becoming a better person than Diane had raised him to be, which said something about the resilience of human conscience. I added his contact information to my evidence file and made a note for my attorney. Drew's testimony would destroy any remaining sympathy Diane might claim. A son turning against his mother wasn't just dramatic. It was devastating. The community's transformation accelerated after Diane's arrest. What had been whispered doubts became open discussion. Kate Rivera, now interim HOA president by unanimous emergency vote, called town halls where people could voice concerns that had been festering for years. The attendance was standing room only. Stories emerged. A pattern of selective enforcement so consistent it couldn't be coincidence. Diane's friends got violations dismissed. Her opponents got fined for infractions that had never been problems before. People who questioned her decisions found themselves socially isolated, left off invitation lists, whispered about at neighborhood gatherings. She created a kingdom based on fear, Kate said to me over coffee one morning. And we all let her because it was easier than fighting, easier than risking becoming her next target. That's how tyranny works, I said. In neighborhoods and nations both, people trade freedom for the illusion of security, trade truth for the comfort of not being singled out. Kate looked at me with something like wonder. How are you not angrier? After what she did to Tom, after months of harassment that contributed to his death, how are you so calm? I'm not calm, I said. I'm focused. There's a difference. Anger is fine as fuel, terrible as navigation. The board launched a comprehensive investigation into Diane's tenure. Every decision she'd made, every variance she'd approved, every contract she'd awarded. What they found was a masterclass in corruption disguised as competence. Landscaping contracts awarded to her brother-in-law, who'd been dead for 2 years. The work billed but never performed. Money vanishing into accounts nobody had audited. Conference attendance reimbursed for events that didn't exist. Hotels that had no record of her staying there. Consulting fees paid to shell companies that trace back to her maiden name, her ex-husband's business partner, her sister's LLC. The total was over $90,000 across 6 years. Not enough to make national news, plenty enough to destroy her reputation and empty the HOA's reserves and leave residents wondering what else they'd missed. And through every board meeting, every revelation, every shocked conversation, the wall stood. Physical proof that truth, properly documented and protected, survived everything thrown at it. Tom's engineering had proven more resilient than Diane's lies. His foresight had outlasted her schemes. I was cataloging the latest audit findings when the doorbell rang. 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, sunny and warm, the kind of day that felt at odds with everything happening. I checked the security camera feed before opening the door. Habit now, and saw a man I didn't recognize. 50s, expensive suit, briefcase, the kind of person who looked like money and knew it. I opened the door but left the screen latched. Can I help you? Mrs. Webb. I'm Jackson Riley. We haven't met formally, but I believe you're aware of my development project. His smile was practiced, the kind that came from a lifetime of selling things to people who didn't know they wanted them yet. I was hoping we could talk. Just a few minutes of your time. Every instinct I developed teaching teenagers told me this man was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. This was the person who'd emailed Diane about handling the web problem, who'd put her in a position where she owed penalties if the project failed, who'd created the financial pressure that made her desperate enough to harass a dying man. We can talk here, I said, not unlocking the screen. I'm listening. Riley's smile didn't falter, but something changed in his eyes. Recalculation. I think we got off on the wrong foot, you and I. What happened with Diane Hartley is unfortunate, truly. I had no idea she was engaging in harassment or financial impropriety. The lie was smooth as glass and just as transparent. I'm a businessman, he continued. I solve problems. Right now, you and I have a mutual problem. The Hartley Meadows project is good for this community. Increases property values, brings in tax revenue, creates construction jobs. Everybody wins. Except the people who lose their peace and quiet, I said, and the environment that gets paved over, and the infrastructure that gets stressed beyond capacity. All manageable concerns, Riley said, waving them away like smoke. The point is, that project needs road access. The variance requires demonstrated community infrastructure. Your property is key to that. My property isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. He opened his briefcase, pulled out an envelope. I'm prepared to offer you $150,000 for a permanent access easement across the southern 40 acres. You keep the land. I get legal right-of-way. Clean, simple, everybody's happy. I looked at the envelope without touching it. That's a lot of money. It's fair compensation. Plus, it makes the legal troubles go away. Diane's facing charges partly because she couldn't secure access legally. You sell me the easement, that problem disappears, reduces her liability, makes you look reasonable. Win-win. The manipulation was exquisite. He was offering me money while simultaneously suggesting I could reduce Diane's criminal exposure by cooperating. Making it seem like doing him a favor would be doing her a favor. appealing to whatever sympathy I might have for a woman facing ruin. He'd badly misjudged me. No, I said. Riley's practiced expression slipped for just a moment. I'm sorry? No, not interested. My property isn't for sale at any price. The access route you want doesn't exist legally and never will. Your development project is dead, and my wall is the headstone. His smile vanished entirely. Mrs. Webb, I don't think you understand what you're turning down. This is a very generous offer. More than fair market value for a strip of land you're not even using. I understand perfectly. You're offering me money to legitimize 7 years of trespassing, to reward Diane's harassment of my husband, and to undo everything Tom fought for in his final months. The answer is no. You're making a serious mistake. The friendly tone was gone now, replaced with something colder, harder. I have lawyers who can drag you through depositions and discovery for years, can make your life very expensive and very complicated, can dig into your husband's medical history, his mental state before he died, whether his documented concerns were rational or symptomatic of decline. The threat was explicit now. Cooperate or he'd weaponize Tom's death against me. Imply Tom had been mentally unstable. Drag his memory through court and turn his final fight into evidence of diminished capacity. My husband documented everything, I said, voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. His mental state was clear. His concerns were valid, his engineering was sound, and every doctor who treated him will testify he was competent until the moment his heart stopped. But you go ahead and try. Discovery goes both ways. And I have a lot of documentation about how your project depended on manufactured community support and trespass patterns you knew about and encouraged. Riley's jaw tightened. I never encouraged trespassing. You emailed Diane 3 months before my husband died. Told her Tom was a problem. Told her to handle the situation or you'd reconsider your partnership. I have the email, time-stamped, with your signature block. Want to tell me again how you didn't know what she was doing? His face went carefully blank. Where did you get that email? Doesn't matter. What matters is it's part of the permanent record now, sealed in chambers that trigger automatic release if tampered with. You can sue me for the next decade, and all you'll accomplish is making sure that email gets read by more people. Riley stared at me for a long moment, then closed his briefcase with a sharp click. You're going to regret this. I'm offering you a clean way out. After this, I won't be so generous. After this, you'll be focused on your own legal exposure, conspiracy to harass, potential RICO charges if the DA wants to get creative, liability for any stress-related health impacts Tom suffered because of coordination between you and Diane. I'd been researching, making lists, exploring every possible legal avenue with my attorney. Riley didn't know how much was real threat versus bluff, and that uncertainty showed in his eyes. Get off my property, I said, and don't come back. He left without another word. I watched through the security cameras as he got in his luxury sedan and drove away too fast, gravel spraying. Probably the first time someone had told him no in years. The first time money hadn't solved his problem. I called my attorney immediately and recounted the entire conversation while it was fresh. He whistled low. He threatened to attack Tom's mental state. That's discoverable bad faith. If he files anything now, we can use this conversation to show malicious intent. Good, I said. Let him try. I'm done being nice to people who mistake patience for weakness. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested Tom's complete medical records from his cardiologist. As his widow and executor, I had legal right to everything. The clerk processed the request efficiently, and I left with a flash drive containing 10 years of cardiac care documentation. Back home, I opened the files and started reading chronologically. Building the timeline. Tom's secret notebook had hinted at, but not fully documented, looking for the pattern that connected Diane's harassment to Tom's declining health. The early records showed a man in good cardiac shape for his age, some arterial plaque, typical for a man in his 50s, blood pressure slightly elevated but controlled with medication, exercise tolerance good, risk factors manageable. Then, 15 months before his death, the numbers started changing. Blood pressure readings creeping higher despite medication adjustments. Heart rate variability decreasing, sign of stress. Patient self-reporting sleep disturbances. Difficulty relaxing. Persistent worry about ongoing conflict with neighbor. The notes were clinical but damning. Patient reports escalating dispute over property access. States he feels harassed and dismissed by local authority figure, experiencing anxiety symptoms, recommended stress management counseling. Patient declined, said he needs to resolve situation first. 6 months before death. Patient's blood pressure remains poorly controlled despite medication increase, reports continuing high stress from property dispute, sleep quality poor, has been experiencing occasional chest discomfort after confrontational encounters. Advised patient to consider removing himself from stressful situation. Patient states he can't abandon the fight on principle grounds. 3 months before death. Patient presented with elevated BP 165/98 after described hostile interaction with HOA president. Report she mocked his health concerns and suggested he worry less about property and more about protecting his health. Patient visibly agitated during visit. Stress clearly affecting cardiac function. Strongly recommended psychiatric consult for anxiety management. Patient refused. State situation should be resolved within weeks. 1 month before death. Patient called to schedule appointment, reporting chest pain after argument. Earliest availability in 2 weeks. Patient said he'd monitor and call if symptoms worsened. That appointment had been scheduled for 3 days after Tom died. He'd never made it. I read through the entire file twice, building the timeline that proved what I'd suspected. Diane's harassment had directly, measurably affected Tom's health, not speculation, not theory, documented medical fact. His blood pressure had spiked after confrontations with her. His sleep had suffered. His cardiac function had declined under chronic stress. And she'd known he had a heart condition because the HOA insurance paperwork required disclosure. She'd known, and she'd used it as a weapon anyway, had mocked him for being concerned about something that was literally killing him. I copied everything, added it to the archive documentation, updated my attorney. The medical records wouldn't prove legal causation, couldn't prove Diane's harassment had caused the heart attack, but they proved the harassment had affected his health. That stress from her conduct had measurable cardiac consequences, that mocking a man for health concerns while escalating the very stress harming him was moral culpability, even if it wasn't criminal. Tom's voice spoke through those medical notes, his worry, his determination, his refusal to back down even when his doctor advised retreat. He'd been fighting for principle while his heart was giving out, and Diane had made that fight harder every step of the way. That afternoon, as I was adding the medical timeline to my evidence files, Kate called. "You need to see this," she said, voice tight. "Check the neighborhood message board." I pulled it up on my laptop. The main discussion thread had exploded with activity. Someone had posted the complete Riley development proposal, including the commission structure and the penalty clause Diane faced if the project failed. Someone else had posted her arrest record. A third person had compiled every HOA financial irregularity the audit had revealed. But the post getting the most attention was a letter from Drew, posted publicly, addressed to the community. "I need to tell you the truth about the accident my mother has been using to justify maintaining access across the Webb property. There was no serious accident. I fell off my bike and scraped my arm. That's it. My mother exaggerated the injury, filed a fraudulent insurance claim, and has been using that story for 7 years to manufacture justification for access that was always illegal trespassing. She taught me that integrity matters, that truth matters, that standing up for what's right is more important than what's comfortable. Then she did the opposite. She harassed a good man in his final months because his property rights got in the way of her financial deal. She knew he had a heart condition and she mocked him for being concerned about stress. She contributed to his suffering, and I won't be part of the lie anymore. I love my mother, but what she did was wrong. And the Webb family deserves better than silence from people who know the truth. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm speaking up now." The post had over 200 comments, some supportive, some shocked, a few accusing Drew of betraying his mother. But the majority were people sharing their own stories of Diane's manipulation. The dam had broken. Truth was flooding out. I called Drew's number. He answered on the first ring. "Did you see it?" he asked. "I did. That took courage." "It took too long." His voice was thick with emotion. "I should have said something years ago. Should have told the truth about the insurance fraud. Should have stopped her from using me as an excuse. You were a child when it started. You're doing the right thing now. That's what matters." "Is it enough?" he asked. To make up for years of staying silent? There's no ledger that balances that kind of thing, I said. You just do better going forward. That's all any of us can do. After we hung up, I sat with Tom's medical file open in front of me and thought about the different kinds of courage. The courage to fight when fighting costs everything. The courage to tell the truth when lying is easier. The courage to finish what someone else started even when you're terrified of failing them. Tom had the first kind. Drew had the second. I was learning the third. That night, I wrote to Tom in the journal that had become my way of staying connected to him across the silence of death. Your medical records tell a story you never wanted me to know. About chest pain and sleepless nights and blood pressure that climbed with every confrontation. About doctors telling you to walk away and you refusing on principle. About appointments you delayed because you were protecting me from worry. I'm angry about that. Angry that you carried it alone. Angry that you thought shielding me was more important than your health. Angry that you died proving a point when I would have rather had you alive and wrong. But I understand it too. You were raised to protect, to shoulder burdens, to handle things yourself rather than worry your wife. And that's what killed you as much as the heart disease. The belief that being a good husband meant suffering alone. Drew posted publicly today, told the truth about his mother's fraud, about the accident that never was, about everything she's done, 29 years old and braver than most people twice his age. The community knows now, all of it, the harassment, the fraud, the way she weaponized your health against you. And they're horrified, finally horrified. I wish that mattered more, wish it brought you back, but it doesn't. You're still gone and I'm still here, and all the truth in the world doesn't fill that space. But the truth does something. It makes your fight mean something, makes sure people know you weren't paranoid or unreasonable or confused. You were right about everything. And she was wrong. That has to be enough because it's all we have left. I closed the journal as headlights swept across the living room window. A car pulling into my driveway at 9 at night. The security system identified it before I could check. Diane Hartley's Mercedes. She'd been out on bail for a week. I hadn't seen her since the arrest. Hadn't expected to see her until trial. But here she was, getting out of her car like she had every right to be here, walking up to my door like the last 2 weeks hadn't happened. I met her on the porch, didn't invite her closer. She looked terrible. Hair uncombed, no makeup, clothes rumpled, the polished exterior completely gone, revealing the exhausted, desperate person underneath. I need you to drop the charges, she said without preamble. Please, I'll lose everything, my real estate license, my house, any chance at the commission, please. No, I said. You don't understand what this will cost me. I'll be bankrupt, unemployable, destroyed. You destroyed yourself. I just documented it. Your husband would have forgiven me. The words came out desperate, manipulative. He was a kind man. He wouldn't have wanted this. The fury that rose in me was white-hot and absolutely controlled. My husband would have wanted you to face consequences for making his final months hell, for using his health as a weapon, for harassing him while his heart was literally failing. I didn't know it was that bad. I thought he was exaggerating. Lots of people exaggerate health problems when they want sympathy. He documented chest pain in his journal 3 days before he died. You knew he had a heart condition. You mocked him for being concerned about it. You escalated conflict you knew was stressing him. Don't stand here and claim ignorance. Diane's face crumpled. I made mistakes. I was under pressure. The development deal, the commission, the penalty clause if it fell through. I needed that shortcut, needed the variance, needed everything to work and your husband wouldn't cooperate, and I snapped. I made bad decisions. You made calculated decisions for months, systematically. That's not snapping. That's harassment. Please. She was crying now, mascara-less tears running down her face. I have nothing left. Drew won't talk to me. The board fired me. Riley abandoned me. The whole community hates me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about Tom, about everything. Please just give me this one thing. Drop the criminal charges. Let me disappear. Part of me, the part that had spent 30 years teaching, wanted to offer some path to redemption. Some way for her to earn forgiveness through genuine change. But another part, the part that had read Tom's medical records and seen how her cruelty had measurably harmed him, knew that some things couldn't be forgiven by the living. If Tom were here, he'd be the one to forgive you or not, I said. But he's not here, partly because of stress you caused. So I can't offer you forgiveness that isn't mine to give. Then what am I supposed to do? Accept the consequences of your choices. Plead guilty. Show genuine remorse. Try to become the person who wouldn't do what you did. That's all any of us can do after we've hurt people. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back to her car, paused with the door open. I didn't mean for him to die, she said, voice small. I never wanted that. But you didn't care enough to stop when you knew it was hurting him. That's the problem. Not that you wanted him dead, that you wanted your commission more than you wanted to stop causing harm. She got in her car and drove away. I stood on the porch watching taillights disappear into darkness and felt nothing but exhaustion. No triumph, no vindication. Just the tired aftermath of necessary confrontation. Inside, I added notes about the conversation to my documentation. Then I tried to sleep and couldn't, so I sat at the kitchen table with Tom's notebook open in front of me, rereading his final entries. At 3:47 in the morning, the security system's loudest alarm triggered. Not motion sensors. Impact alert. Someone hitting the wall with enough force to register on structural monitors. I grabbed my phone and pulled up camera feeds. Diane's Mercedes was there again, but she wasn't trying to pry the wall apart this time. She was trying to drive through it. The car accelerated from the property line, headlights bouncing wildly as it hit the uneven ground. Aimed straight at the wall, like she thought velocity and desperation would be enough to break what tools had failed to breach. I called 911 and watched 3 different camera angles while the dispatcher took information. The first impact came at 30 miles per hour. The Mercedes hit the wall and the wall didn't move. Concrete absorbed the impact, distributed force exactly as Tom had engineered it to. The car's front end crumpled, airbags deployed, metal screamed. Diane reversed, tires spinning, gouging earth. The car was damaged but mobile, front bumper hanging loose, one headlight shattered. She accelerated again. The second impact was harder, faster, physics and desperation combined. More metal crumpling, more force absorbed harmlessly by reinforced concrete. The wall shuddered slightly, but held. Tom had overbuilt for exactly this scenario. Had anticipated someone trying to destroy evidence through force. Diane backed up again. I could see her through the windshield now, face twisted with something beyond reason. She was screaming something I couldn't hear through safety glass and distance. The third impact was the hardest yet. Full throttle, maybe 50 miles per hour. The Mercedes hit the wall at a slight angle this time, and that angle changed everything. The impact demolished the car's front passenger side, but it also broke through the outer layer of concrete at the wall's corner, where 2 sections joined at an engineered seam. The spot Tom had deliberately designed as a weak point, because sometimes failures need to be controlled, directed, managed. The wall didn't collapse. It opened. The collision exposed something Diane couldn't have known existed. Something I'd almost forgotten Tom had built. Chamber 2. The backup layer accessed only if the outer defense was compromised. Metal boxes tumbled out of the broken concrete, scattering across ground littered with shattered headlight glass and torn bumper pieces. Waterproof cases labeled in Tom's precise handwriting. Contents spilling across the earth like truth refusing to stay buried. Tom's journals. The originals I thought were in the safe deposit box. Copies of everything, yes, but also the actual notebooks where his hand had moved across pages documenting harassment and stress and chest pain and sleepless nights. Physical evidence of suffering in his own writing. Medical appointment cards. Prescription bottles. Doctor's notes about elevated blood pressure and anxiety and stress-related cardiac symptoms. All sealed in waterproof cases. Preserved exactly as he'd left them. Hidden in a chamber that would only open if someone tried to destroy the outer evidence. Sirens approaching. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, needing to secure the evidence before weather or Diane or circumstance destroyed it. Diane was still in the car, slumped over the deflated airbag, conscious but dazed. Blood running from her nose, crying or moaning or both. Deputies arrived while I was gathering scattered documentation. The same laid deputy from the midnight break-in arrest, expression grim as she surveyed the scene. "Mrs. Webb again?" "Again," I agreed. They extracted Diane from the wreck with mechanical efficiency, read her rights for the second time in 2 weeks, charged her with assault with a deadly weapon, attempted destruction of evidence, violation of bail conditions, reckless endangerment, and Diane, bleeding and crying, and completely broken, confessed to all of it. Told them about the commission and the penalty clause and how the wall had destroyed everything and she just needed it gone, needed the evidence destroyed, needed one thing to go right because everything else had failed. She told them about the development deal, about Riley's emails telling her to handle Tom, about using HOA funds to position herself for the payout. Told them things I didn't even know, connections I hadn't made, fraud deeper than anyone had documented. Told them everything while body cameras recorded and deputies exchanged glances that said they'd never seen someone self-destruct so thoroughly. When they finally led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at the wall one final time, at the scattered evidence she'd tried to destroy, at the concrete that had held firm despite everything she'd thrown at it. "I should have just apologized," she said, right at the beginning. "Should have just said sorry and meant it." "Yes," I said. "You should have." They drove her away to county lockup this time. No bail, too many violations, too much flight risk. I stood in the wreckage as dawn broke, gathering evidence and photographing damage and documenting everything, because that's what Tom had taught me. Evidence matters, truth matters, documentation protects both. The wall had held. Broken at one designed weak point, yes, but held everywhere else. Proved that Tom's engineering had been perfect, that his 3 steps ahead thinking had accounted for even this. Rick showed up around 6, saw the damage, whistled low. She really tried to drive through it. 3 times that. Wall held. Tom built it to last. Rick helped me collect scattered evidence while deputies secured the scene. We worked in silence, gathering papers and cases and everything Diane's desperation had exposed. Chamber 2 had held Tom's most personal documentation. The medical evidence I'd been gathering from official sources was here too, but in his own hand, journal entries about chest pain, notes to himself about doctor's appointments, reminders to take medication after stressful encounters, a life documented, a death foreshadowed, all preserved in waterproof steel waiting to be discovered. Tom had gathered all of it, sealed it, hidden it in a chamber that would only be exposed if someone tried to destroy the outer defenses. He'd planned for everything, even Diane's final desperate attack. By noon, I'd documented the scene, collected the evidence, and called a concrete contractor to evaluate the damage. The wall could be repaired. The design allowed for it. But I thought about leaving it partially broken, a monument not to victory, but to the cost of trying to bury truth. That night I wrote to Tom about what his hidden chamber had revealed. She came back, tried to destroy the wall with her car, 3 impacts. The wall held everywhere except where you designed it to fail safely. And that designed failure exposed Chamber 2. Your personal archive. The evidence even I didn't know you'd sealed away. Your journals were there, Tom. The originals. I thought they were in the safe deposit box, but you'd hidden copies in the wall, along with appointment cards and prescription bottles and medical notes documenting exactly how her harassment affected your health. You thought of everything, literally everything, even how to turn someone's attempt at destruction into their own exposure. She confessed to it all, on camera, in front of deputies, destroyed herself more thoroughly than any prosecutor could have. She said at the end that she should have just apologized, should have said sorry and meant it at the beginning instead of fighting for 2 years. She was right. But by the time people realize that, it's always too late. The harm is done. The consequences are in motion. The apology doesn't undo the damage. You knew that too. That's why you built the wall. Because apologies don't stop people who care more about profit than pain. Only consequences do. I miss you. But I'm grateful for everything you left me. The blueprint, the evidence, the protection, the absolute certainty that truth, properly defended, survives everything. The wall held, just like you knew it would, just like you planned. I'm finishing this for both of us. The next morning, the county DA called. They wanted to meet, discuss charges, talk about what happened next. Diane was facing multiple felonies now: criminal trespass, attempted vandalism, attempted destruction of evidence, assault with a deadly weapon, HOA fraud, insurance fraud from Drew's fabricated accident 7 years ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Her own confessions on multiple body cameras, security footage of both attacks, financial records proving embezzlement, Drew's testimony about insurance fraud, medical records showing the impact of harassment on Tom's health. We can offer her a plea deal, the DA said. 5 years, eligible for parole in 3. She pleads to all counts, agrees to restitution, cooperates with any civil suits. What if she doesn't take it? I asked. Then we go to trial, and she's looking at 15 to 20 based on the charges. But trials are unpredictable. Juries can be sympathetic. She might play the desperate widow card, the financial pressure defense. We might lose. I thought about Tom, about his journals documenting months of harassment, about his medical records showing measurable health decline, about Drew finding the courage to testify against his own mother, about the wall standing witness to everything. Offer her the deal, I said, but make it contingent on a public apology, a real one, not a legal statement drafted by lawyers, her own words admitting what she did and why it was wrong. The DA considered. That's unusual, but I can include it in the terms. 2 days later, Diane accepted the plea deal. Part of the agreement required a written statement to be read in open court and published in the local newspaper. No lawyers editing it, just her words. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I sat in the gallery with Kate and Rick and Drew, who'd flown in from California to be there. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, board members, people who'd suffered under Diane's rule, and people who'd benefited from it. Diane looked small at the defendant's table, diminished, the expensive clothes replaced with county jail orange, the perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the confidence completely gone. The judge asked her to read her statement. Diane stood, hands shaking, and began to speak. I harassed Thomas Webb for 8 months before his death. I knew he had a heart condition. I knew stress was dangerous for him. And I escalated conflict anyway, because my financial interests mattered more to me than his health. When he died, I felt guilty for about an hour. Then I thought his death might actually help me, because widows are easier to manipulate than engineers. I was wrong about everything. Wrong to prioritize money over human decency. Wrong to use HOA authority to serve personal profit. Wrong to think rules didn't apply to me. Wrong to teach my son that integrity mattered while demonstrating the opposite. I stole from the HOA. I lied to the community. I fabricated my son's accident to manufacture justification for illegal trespassing. I attacked Mrs. Webb's property twice, trying to destroy evidence of my crimes. I'm guilty of everything I'm charged with and things I'm not charged with. I'm sorry for the harm I caused, sorry for betraying the trust people placed in me, sorry for making Thomas Webb's final months harder than they had to be. Sorry isn't enough. It doesn't undo what I did, but it's all I have to offer now that everything else is gone. She sat down. The courtroom was silent. No drama, no outburst, just the quiet aftermath of someone finally telling the truth after years of lies. The judge accepted her plea, sentenced her to 5 years with eligibility for parole in 3, ordered restitution to the HOA and to me, made the apology part of the permanent record. Outside the courthouse, Drew approached me. "Thank you," he said, "for making her face it, for not letting her hide behind lawyers and plea deals." "Your testimony made the difference," I said. "Your courage to tell the truth." "I learned that from her, actually, before she forgot it herself." He looked back at the courthouse. "She used to tell me that character is what you do when no one's watching. Turns out she only had character when people were watching." I thought about that as I drove home, about character and integrity, and the difference between who we claim to be and who we actually are when tested. Tom had been tested, had chosen principle over peace, had documented truth even when it cost him sleep and health and eventually life. Diane had been tested, had chosen profit over decency, had lied and stolen and harassed until consequences caught up. And I'd been tested too, had to choose between revenge and justice, between destroying her completely and giving her a chance at redemption through truth. I'd chosen justice, the harder path, the one that required her to face what she'd done rather than just suffer for it. Whether she'd actually change remained to be seen. But at least she'd told the truth. Finally. Under compulsion, yes, but truth regardless. The wall stood when I got home, damaged but undefeated. The contractor was scheduled to repair it next week, but I decided to leave the broken section as memorial, a reminder that truth survives attempts at destruction, that evidence, properly protected, outlasts lies, that some boundaries hold no matter how hard people try to drive through them. Tom's fight was finished now. The wall he'd designed had done exactly what he'd intended. Protected evidence, exposed corruption, survived everything thrown at it. and I'd kept my promise to him. Had finished what he started, had made sure his final fight meant something. The community was healing, the HOA was reformed, Diane was facing consequences. Drew had found his integrity, truth had prevailed. Not because truth always wins, but because Tom had built protections that made truth impossible to bury. Because he'd been 3 steps ahead even after death. Because he'd loved me enough to leave a blueprint for justice I could follow. Some promises transcend death. Some fights continue beyond the grave. And some walls, properly built, stand forever as witness to what one good man fought for and what one widow finished in his name. The real ending wasn't in courthouse or jail or broken concrete. It was in knowing Tom's truth would outlast all of us, that his documented evidence would tell his story long after everyone involved was gone. That's the power of building things to last, of planning 3 steps ahead, of making sure truth survives. Tom had built that wall knowing he might not live to see it completed, but he'd built it anyway. Because some legacies are worth creating even when you won't be there to witness them. I was his legacy now, his voice, his fight continued and concluded. The wall stood witness, and witnesses, properly protected, tell their stories forever. 3 months after Diane was led away in handcuffs for the final time, the contractor finished repairing the wall. He'd wanted to seal the broken section completely, make it look like the ramming attack had never happened. I told him to leave it partially open, visible but protected, a window into what the wall had been built to preserve. "You sure?" he'd asked, looking at the exposed chamber like it was a wound that needed closing. "Structurally, it's fine either way, but aesthetically, most people want things sealed up neat." "I'm sure," I had said. "Some scars are worth keeping visible." So he'd reinforced the opening, installed tempered glass panels that let you see inside without compromising the waterproofing, and built a small roof overhang to protect it from weather. The result was part memorial, part museum. Tom's documentation visible through glass. Physical proof that truth, once properly protected, survived every attempt at destruction. The neighborhood changed after Diane's sentencing. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the small ways that matter. People started showing up to HOA meetings again, asking questions, demanding transparency. The new board, led by Kate, instituted financial audits every quarter and required all expenditures over $500 to be voted on publicly. The culture of fear Diane had cultivated dissolved slowly, replaced by something healthier. People still disagreed, still had conflicts over property lines and noise complaints, and all the petty tensions that come with living near other humans. But they resolved them honestly now, without the underlying current of intimidation that had made every interaction feel like potential ammunition. Rick helped me plant a garden along the wall's base. Nothing fancy. Native grasses and wildflowers that wouldn't need much maintenance, things that would grow and spread and eventually soften the concrete without hiding it. Beauty emerging from boundaries, which felt right somehow. "Tom would have liked this," Rick said one afternoon, hands dirty from planting purple coneflowers. He was always talking about native species, how they support the ecosystem better than ornamentals. "He had opinions about everything," I said, and smiled at the memory. "Especially things most people never think about. That's what made him good at what he did. Engineers who only think about the obvious stuff build bridges that fall down." Rick sat back on his heels, surveyed our work. He thought 3 steps ahead, planned for failures, built in redundancies. That's why the wall held. I looked at the structure we'd spent months fighting over and fighting for. 40 feet long, 6 feet high, 3 feet thick at the base, reinforced with steel, embedded with chambers of evidence, designed to fail safely at one specific point if attacked, every element serving multiple purposes. "It's more than a wall," I said. "Always was," Rick agreed. "Walls aren't about keeping things out. They're about making clear where boundaries exist." Tom understood that. The civil suits came next. The HOA sued Diane for restitution of the embezzled funds. They won a judgment for $93,000 plus interest, to be paid through seizure of her remaining assets and garnishment of any future income. Her house went up for sale. Her car was already totaled. Her retirement accounts were emptied to cover legal fees and restitution. Everything she'd spent 7 years building and stealing and protecting evaporated in 6 months of consequences. Financial ruin delivered with mechanical efficiency by a legal system that cared about documentation and evidence and properly filed claims. Riley Development faced scrutiny too. The County Planning Commission launched an investigation into the variance application, found evidence of misrepresentation, and blacklisted Riley from submitting projects in the jurisdiction for 5 years. Not criminal charges, but enough to make him radioactive to investors and lenders who didn't want association with tainted deals. He tried to distance himself from Diane, claimed ignorance, produced carefully worded statements about being deceived by a consultant. But the emails I'd provided to authorities told a different story. The timeline of his pressure on her to handle the web problem, the knowledge he'd had about community access issues, the partnership structure that made her desperate enough to harass a dying man. Riley didn't go to prison. Rich developers rarely do. But he lost credibility, lost projects, lost the reputation he'd spent decades building. Not justice exactly, but consequences. Drew visited twice in those 3 months. The first time was awkward. We sat in the living room making careful conversation, both of us aware we were connected by trauma and truth-telling, but didn't really know each other beyond that. "I've been thinking about becoming a teacher," he said at one point. "Maybe high school, math, or science. Something where I can help kids learn integrity matters." "Your mother was a teacher once," I said, "before she got into real estate." "I know. She told me she left teaching because the pay was terrible and the bureaucracy was soul-crushing." Drew looked at his hands. "But I think the real reason was she couldn't handle being held to actual standards. Teachers get evaluated, get observed, have to answer to parents and administrators and state requirements. She wanted authority without accountability." "That's what the HOA presidency gave her," I said, "until you and Tom took it away." He met my eyes. "Thank you for that, for not letting her get away with it, for making me face what she'd become." "You made yourself face it," I said. "I just provided documentation." His second visit was easier. We talked about his father, about the divorce, about the slow process of understanding that people you love can do terrible things, and love doesn't require you to lie about it. "Dad wants to meet you," Drew said. "If you're willing. He feels guilty about not doing more when he saw what Mom was becoming." "Tell him I understand," I said. Sometimes the people closest to a situation are the least able to stop it. They're too emotionally invested, too compromised by love and history and hope that things will get better without intervention. We stood by the wall together before he left, looking at the visible chamber through protective glass. "My accident story is in there," Drew said quietly, pointing at the documentation visible inside. "The insurance fraud, the doctor's notes she coached me to lie about, physical proof I was part of it." "You were 14, I said. "You didn't know what you were part of." I knew enough. I knew we were exaggerating. I just trusted her when she said it was fine, that everyone did it, that insurance companies expected a little inflation. He touched the glass like it was a confession booth. "I'm glad it's here. Glad the truth is preserved. Makes it harder to forget what happened when the evidence is literally set in stone." The wall had become something I hadn't anticipated. Not just protection for my property or vindication for Tom's fight. It had become a kind of witness, a permanent record of what happened when someone chose profit over decency and faced people who wouldn't bend. Other neighbors started coming by to see it. Not many at first, just people who'd been targeted by Diane's selective enforcement over the years. They'd stand in front of the visible chamber, reading what they could see through glass, and I'd watch their faces cycle through validation and anger and something like relief. "I thought I was crazy," one woman said. Her name was Patricia. She'd been fined repeatedly for garden violations that Diane's friends never got cited for. "Thought maybe I was just bad at following rules." But it wasn't me, it was her. And seeing this, seeing proof that she was corrupt, that Tom documented everything, it helps. "Helps how?" I asked. "Helps me trust my own perception again. Helps me know I wasn't overreacting when I felt targeted. Helps me believe that standing up to bullies matters even when you're scared." Patricia touched the glass like Drew had. "Your husband was brave. You finishing his fight was brave. This wall is proof that brave people can win." I didn't feel brave. Felt tired mostly. Felt like someone who'd been running on adrenaline and duty for so long that stopping felt dangerous. But if the wall gave other people courage, if Tom's documentation helped them trust their own experiences, then maybe the fight had been worth more than just personal vindication. The local newspaper did a feature about it. Small piece, nothing major, but it framed the story accurately. HOA President's corruption exposed by engineers' documentation. Widow finishes husband's fight. Wall becomes monument to transparency and accountability. The reporter, a young woman in her 30s, interviewed me at the property, took photos of the wall, the visible chamber, the garden growing along its base. "This is a pretty incredible story," she said. "David versus Goliath, except David won." "Tom won," I corrected. I just made sure his victory was acknowledged. "But you're the one who built the wall, who installed the chambers, who kept fighting after he died." "I followed his blueprint," I said. "Tom did the hard part. The planning, the documentation, the 3 steps ahead thinking that made the whole thing possible. I just executed what he'd already designed." The reporter looked at me with something between sympathy and frustration. "Why won't you take credit for what you did?" "Because it's not about credit," I said. "It's about truth. And the truth is Tom planned this fight before he died, prepared for it, built the defenses. I'm grateful I got to finish it for him. But pretending I did it alone would be lying, and lies are what started all this trouble." The article ran the following Sunday, front page of the local section. Mostly accurate, though they made it sound more dramatic than it felt living through it. Painted me as a grieving widow who'd built a monument to her husband's memory while fighting corruption and winning against impossible odds. The truth was messier, less heroic, more about paperwork and patience and documentation than dramatic confrontations. But I suppose newspapers needed narrative arc more than they needed tedious accuracy. What surprised me was the response. Letters to the editor from people in other neighborhoods sharing similar experiences with HOA corruption. Calls from residents asking how to document violations. Requests for copies of Tom's blueprint from people who wanted to protect their own property rights. The wall became symbolic of something larger than our specific fight. It represented the idea that regular people could stand up to petty tyrants and win if they were methodical enough, patient enough, willing to document everything and prepare for the long game. Tom would have hated the attention. He'd been a private person. But he would have loved that his engineering was helping other people solve problems. That's what engineers do. Build solutions, design systems, create frameworks others can use. 4 months after Diane's sentencing, Kate organized a neighborhood gathering at the property. Not a party exactly. More like a memorial service for the old HOA culture and a celebration of the new transparency. People brought food, kids ran around the yard, someone set up a grill. The afternoon had that peculiar quality of community events where everyone's slightly awkward but showing up anyway because presence matters more than comfort. I stood by the wall watching neighbors interact without the underlying tension that had defined the community for years. People who'd been afraid to speak up were vocal now, asking questions, sharing concerns, trusting that they wouldn't be punished for honesty. The change wasn't dramatic, wasn't cinematic, just small moments of people being able to disagree without fear, being able to question without consequences, being able to exist without constantly calculating whether they were making themselves a target. Linda Chen approached me mid-afternoon, looking uncertain and years older than the last time I'd really looked at her. The treasurer who'd helped Diane hide financial irregularities, who'd buried the liability letter, who'd been complicit through fear and learned helplessness. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for not standing up when Tom was fighting alone, for burying evidence I knew mattered, for choosing my own comfort over his safety." I looked at her. Really looked. Saw genuine remorse mixed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying guilt for months. "You testified at the audit hearings," I said, "told the truth about Diane's instructions. That took courage." "It took too long," Linda said. "If I'd spoken up when Tom was alive, maybe things would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have been under so much stress. Maybe his heart wouldn't have—" She didn't finish. Couldn't finish. Because we both knew that path led nowhere productive. Just endless what-ifs and maybes that changed nothing. "You can't undo the past," I said. "But you can do better going forward. That's all any of us can do." "Is that enough?" she asked. Same question Drew had asked. Same uncertainty about whether redemption was possible after complicity. "It has to be," I said. Because it's all we have. Linda nodded, tears in her eyes, and moved away. Another person carrying the weight of choices made under pressure. Another human being more complicated than villain or victim labels allowed. "This is what Tom wanted," Kate said, appearing beside me with a plate of potato salad I hadn't asked for but accepted anyway. Not just to win his specific fight, but to change the culture, make it safe to tell the truth. "He would have been terrible at this part," I said, gesturing at the crowd. "The socializing, the small talk. He'd have been hiding in his workshop pretending to work on projects that didn't need working on." "But he'd have been proud of the outcome," Kate said, "of what his documentation accomplished, of the system changes, of people feeling safe again, of Linda and others finding the courage to come clean." I watched Rick explain the wall's engineering to a group of fascinated neighbors, using technical terms they probably didn't understand but appreciating Tom's work anyway. Watched him point to the reinforced sections, the chamber placement, the designed failure point that had worked exactly as intended. Saw grown men nodding seriously, asking questions about concrete mix ratios and rebar spacing, honoring my husband's work in the language engineers speak. Patricia was talking animatedly with 3 other women who'd been targeted by Diane's selective enforcement over the years. I could see them sharing stories, validating each other's experiences, finding solidarity in recognition that they hadn't been crazy or oversensitive, that they'd been targeted, that their perceptions had been accurate, that standing together now meant they'd never be that vulnerable again. Children played near the garden we'd planted, completely unaware they were running past a monument to bureaucratic corruption and its defeat. To them, it was just a wall, just flowers, just a place where adults gathered and talked about boring things. They didn't know about chambers of evidence or midnight ramming attacks or truth preserved in waterproof steel. Maybe that was how it should be. The next generation not carrying the weight of our battles, just benefiting from safer systems, without having to understand what it cost to create them. An older man I recognized from HOA meetings, but had never spoken to, approached with his wife. They stood awkwardly for a moment before he extended his hand. "Theodore Marsh," he said, "and this is my wife Eleanor. We wanted to thank you for finishing what your husband started, for not letting Diane get away with it." I shook his hand. "You're welcome, though Tom deserves the credit. I just followed his blueprint." "We voted against you," Eleanor said abruptly. "At the emergency meeting about the wall, we voted to make you tear it down." The honesty was unexpected. Most people who'd opposed me had quietly revised their positions once Diane's corruption became undeniable. "We believed Diane," Theodore continued. "Believed her story about safety concerns and community access. Believed she was trying to do the right thing and you were being unreasonable." "What changed?" I asked. "We saw the evidence," Eleanor said. "The financial records, the emails with Riley, the documentation of harassment, everything your husband had collected. And we realized we'd been fooled, that we'd sided with someone who was lying to us, that we'd voted against a man who was trying to protect legitimate property rights." "We're sorry," Theodore said. "Sorry we didn't see it sooner. Sorry we didn't stand with your husband when he needed allies. Sorry we made his fight harder by trusting the wrong person." I looked at them. An elderly couple wrestling with the realization that they'd been on the wrong side, that their trust had been weaponized, that good intentions and social pressure had led them to support corruption. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "That takes courage too. Admitting you were wrong, apologizing when you didn't have to." "We had to," Eleanor said. "Can't move forward pretending the past didn't happen. Can't build better systems if we don't acknowledge the old ones failed, because people like us didn't ask hard questions." They moved away, and I stood there thinking about all the different kinds of courage this fight had required. Tom's courage to stand up initially, Drew's courage to testify against his mother, Linda's courage to confess complicity, Theodore and Eleanor's courage to admit being wrong, my own courage to finish what Tom started. Courage wasn't one thing, wasn't simple, was as complicated and varied as the people who needed to find it. "Do you think she'll actually change?" Kate asked quietly. "Diane, in prison, do you think she'll become a better person?" I'd thought about that question a lot. Late at night when sleep wouldn't come and I was left alone with complicated feelings about revenge and redemption and what justice actually meant. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Prison either breaks people or hardens them, rarely improves them." But she told the truth in that courtroom. really told it. Not lawyer-drafted statements, but actual acknowledgement of what she'd done and why it was wrong. You think that matters? I think it's a start. Whether she builds on it or not is up to her. I set down the potato salad, not hungry. I can't forgive her. That's not my place. Tom's not here to offer forgiveness, and I won't do it for him. But I don't have to hate her either. I can just let her be a cautionary tale, a reminder that choosing profit over people has consequences. That's very mature of you, Kate said. It's very tired of me, I corrected. Hate takes energy I don't have anymore. I'd rather spend it on other things. As the gathering wound down and people started leaving, I found myself alone by the wall again. The sun setting, shadows stretching across concrete and glass, and Tom's preserved documentation. I'd kept my promise to him, finished his fight, made sure his final battle meant something. But I hadn't figured out what came next. What you do after the big project is complete, and you're left with regular days that need filling. That night, I opened Tom's journal for the first time in weeks. I'd been avoiding it. Reading his words felt like reopening wounds that were finally starting to scar over. But something pulled me back to it. Maybe the need to remember why we'd fought. Maybe just missing his voice. I found an entry from 2 years before his death, before Diane, before the HOA conflict, before everything went wrong. Margaret came home exhausted today. Parent-teacher conferences. 3 hours of listening to people explain why their children's failures are everyone's fault except their own. She does this with such grace, such patience. I don't know how she doesn't tell them their kids are lazy, entitled brats who need discipline more than excuses. But that's what makes her good at teaching. She sees potential even in difficult students, believes people can change if given the right support and honest feedback. I love that about her. The optimism, the faith in human capacity for growth. I wish I had more of it. I tend to see systems and structures, what works and what doesn't, what's built to last and what's built to fail. Margaret sees people, their struggles, their possibilities. We balance each other that way. I handle the blueprints. She handles the humanity. Together, we make a complete picture. I closed the journal and cried for the first time in months. Not the angry tears that had fueled me through the fight, not the bitter grief that had followed his death, just sadness, clean and simple. Missing someone who'd seen me clearly and loved me anyway. Tom had been right. We had balanced each other. His systematic thinking and my faith in people. His engineering precision and my teaching patience. His 3 steps ahead planning and my ability to connect with humans in their messy emotional reality. And somehow I'd finished his fight using both skill sets. His documentation and strategic thinking. My ability to see Diane as a human making terrible choices rather than a monster beyond redemption. His wall and my willingness to make it visible instead of sealed away. We'd balanced each other even across death. His blueprint and my execution, his evidence and my presentation, his fight and my completion. The next morning I went to his grave for the first time since the funeral. I'd been avoiding it. The physical reminder of loss. The granite marker with dates that bookended a life cut short. But I needed to tell him it was finished. Needed to say it out loud at the place where his body rested. The cemetery was quiet. Early morning, mist rising from grass, birds starting their territorial songs. His marker was simple. Thomas Webb, loving husband, skilled engineer, the dates of his too short life. I sat on the ground next to it, didn't care that the damp earth was soaking through my jeans. I finished it, I said to granite and earth and whatever might remain of the man I'd loved. Your fight, your wall, your plan to protect the evidence and expose the corruption. It worked exactly like you designed it to. Diane's in prison. Drew testified against her. The HOA is reformed. Riley's reputation is destroyed. The community knows the truth. And your wall stands as proof that documentation and preparation and thinking 3 steps ahead can defeat people who think rules don't apply to them. I kept my promise, did what you asked, followed your blueprint, made sure your final fight mattered. But I'm tired, Tom. So tired. And I don't know what comes next. Don't know who I'm supposed to be now that the fight is finished. Don't know how to fill days that aren't structured around promises to the dead. The birds kept singing, the mist kept rising, granite stayed silent. I miss you. Miss your voice, miss your ridiculous level of preparedness for everything. Miss the way you'd spend 3 hours researching the optimal solution to a 5-minute problem. Miss being the person who balanced your systems thinking with human compassion. The wall is beautiful, in its way, functional and protective, and exactly what was needed, just like everything you built. I'm going to leave the broken section visible, turn it into a teaching moment, about truth surviving attempts at destruction, about evidence mattering, about standing up to bullies even when you're scared. That feels right. Making your fight means something beyond our personal vindication. Helping other people find courage to document and resist and trust that preparation defeats corruption. You'd hate the attention, but you'd love that your engineering helps people. I'm going to be okay eventually. Not yet, but eventually. The fight gave me purpose. Now I need to find purpose in something other than finishing what you started. Maybe I'll go back to teaching. Maybe I'll write about what happened. Maybe I'll just tend the garden by your wall and let time do its healing work. But I wanted you to know, it's finished. Your plan worked. Justice happened. Truth prevailed. We won, Tom. Together. Across death and grief and every obstacle Diane threw at us. Thank you for the blueprint, for trusting me to execute it, for loving me enough to protect me even after you were gone. I love you. I'll always love you, and your wall stands witness to everything we fought for. Rest now, you've earned it. I sat there until the mist burned off, and the sun warmed the granite, and my jeans were completely soaked. Then I stood, kissed my fingers, pressed them to his name, and walked back to the car. The drive home took me past the old fire road, the shortcut that had started everything. I pulled over and looked at it. Just a dirt track through trees. Unremarkable. The kind of thing people use without thinking about property rights or legal access or who they're harming with convenience. Someone had put up a chain across the entrance, new posts, official county signage, private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The shortcut was closed, permanently. The variance application had died with the development proposal. The county had confirmed my property rights. The pattern of trespassing was broken. Tom's fight accomplished, his property protected, his boundaries defended. I sat there in the car looking at the closed road and thinking about how much had changed because one man refused to accept that convenience mattered more than rights, because one engineer documented everything systematically, because one widow kept a promise to finish what her husband started. The fight had been about more than the shortcut, had been about whether rules applied equally or selectively, whether authority required accountability, whether corruption could survive in sunshine, whether one person's refusal to bend could change an entire community's culture. We'd proven it could. Tom had proven it. His 3 steps ahead thinking and meticulous documentation and absolute refusal to compromise on principle. I drove home and walked to the wall, stood in front of the visible chamber looking at his documentation preserved behind glass, his handwriting, his systematic approach to evidence collection, his engineering diagrams showing how the chambers would be accessed and protected. A man walking his dog stopped to look. Older guy, 70s maybe, graying hair and weathered face, and the kind of solid presence that comes from decades of keeping promises and showing up when needed. He studied the wall for a long moment. "That's some serious engineering," he said finally. "Your husband built this?" "He designed it," I said. "I executed the plan after he died." "Heard about that. The HOA president embezzling funds. Your husband documenting everything? Hell of a fight." He shook his head admiringly. "Takes guts to stand up to that kind of corruption. Most people just go along. Easier that way." "My husband wasn't interested in easy," I said. "He was interested in right. Rare quality these days. People talk about principles but fold when pressure comes. Your husband lived his principles. That's the difference." He gestured at the wall. "This is proof. Physical proof that preparation and documentation beat corruption every time if you're willing to stay the course." It was his fight originally. I just finished it. The man looked at me with the kind of understanding that comes from living long enough to lose people who mattered. Eyes that had seen marriages and funerals and all the complicated ways love persists after death. "That's what love does, though, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Finishes what needs finishing. Honors what deserves honoring. Keeps promises even when the person you made them to is gone." He paused. "My wife died 6 years ago. Cancer. Before she went, she made me promise I'd finish the garden she'd started. Said she wanted to know it would keep growing even after she couldn't tend it anymore." "Did you finish it?" I asked. Every spring I plant what she would have planted. Every fall I prepare the soil the way she taught me. It's not the same as having her here, but it keeps her present, keeps the promise alive. He looked at the wall. This is your garden, your way of keeping him present, making sure his fight mattered. He walked on with his dog, left me standing there with that truth settling deep. Love finishes what needs finishing. That's what I'd been doing. Not revenge, not even justice exactly. Just love, the kind that survives death, that honors what someone fought for by making sure the fight mattered, that keeps promises because the person you love deserved that and more. The wall wasn't just concrete and steel. It was love made permanent, promise kept in rebar and chambers of evidence, Tom's presence preserved in engineering precision and strategic thinking. I'd built his garden, and it would keep growing, keep standing witness, keep proving that truth survives when properly protected. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, the neighborhood looked different in small ways. New board members who actually read financial reports, quarterly town halls where residents could voice concerns without fear, an anonymous tip line for reporting violations, monitored by people other than the president. The culture had shifted, not perfectly, not completely, but enough that people felt safe again, felt like honesty wouldn't be punished, felt like rules applied equally instead of selectively. Kate stepped down as interim president after helping establish the new systems. She'd done what needed doing, cleaned up the corruption, implemented accountability measures, set the HOA on a healthier path. But she didn't want to be a leader, just wanted to be someone who'd stood up when standing up mattered. "You should run for the board," she told me over coffee one afternoon. "You understand documentation, understand systems, understand what happens when power goes unchecked." "I'm not interested in power," I said. "That's exactly why you should have it," Kate said. "The people who want power are usually the worst ones to give it to. The people who see it as burden and responsibility are the ones who use it well." I thought about that. About Tom and his methodical approach to problems. About teaching and the responsibility of guiding young people. About the wall and what it represented beyond our personal fight. "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't run for the board, but I did start attending meetings, asking questions, reviewing financial reports, not because I wanted authority, because I wanted accountability. Wanted to make sure the systems Kate implemented actually worked. That's what Tom would have done, monitored the systems, made sure the engineering held up under real-world conditions, documented problems and proposed solutions. I could do that. Could be the person who asked uncomfortable questions and demanded transparent answers. Could honor his legacy by making sure corruption stayed exposed and prevented. 8 months after Diane's sentencing, I received a letter from prison, her handwriting on the envelope, no return address needed. I recognized it from HOA documents I'd collected as evidence. I almost threw it away unopened. Didn't want her words in my house. Didn't want her trying to manipulate me from behind bars. But curiosity won. Or maybe the part of me that still believed in redemption needed to see if she'd actually changed. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten. No lawyer editing, just her words. "Mrs. Webb, I don't expect you to read this. Don't expect you to care what I have to say. But my therapist says I need to write it anyway. Need to face what I did to people who deserved better. I harassed your husband while he was dying, made his last months harder than they had to be, used his health vulnerability as a weapon, prioritized my financial interests over his well-being. And when he died, I felt relieved instead of guilty, because I thought his death made my problems easier to solve. That's who I was. Someone who saw a man's death as convenient, who thought widows were easier to manipulate than engineers, who believed authority meant I could do whatever I wanted without consequences. I was wrong about everything. Wrong about you, wrong about the community, wrong about Tom documenting everything, wrong about being able to destroy evidence, wrong about getting away with it. Your husband was smarter than me, better than me, more prepared for the fight I started than I could have imagined, and you were stronger than I thought possible. I underestimated both of you because I'd been winning so long, I forgot that some people actually fight back. I don't know if I'm becoming a better person. Prison doesn't make people better, just gives them time to think about what they did and whether they'd do it differently if they had another chance. I would do it differently. Not because I'm morally transformed, because I've seen what consequences actually cost. Lost everything: family, money, freedom, reputation. Everything I spent years building and stealing and protecting. But mostly I do it differently because your husband deserved better. Deserved to spend his final months in peace instead of fighting me. Deserved to focus on his health instead of my harassment. Deserved to die surrounded by love instead of stress I caused. I can't apologize enough for that. Can't make it right. Can only acknowledge it was wrong and wish I'd been the person who stopped before it got this bad. I don't expect forgiveness. Don't deserve it. Just wanted you to know I understand now what I did. Understand the harm. Understand why you couldn't just let it go. Your wall stands. My kingdom fell. Truth won. I lost. That's how it should be. I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth after everything. Diane Hartley. I read it twice. Looking for manipulation. Hidden agenda. Some angle she was playing. But it read like genuine acknowledgement. Not transformation exactly, but understanding, recognition of harm caused, and consequences deserved. I filed it with the rest of the documentation. Not to use against her, not to show anyone, just to preserve. Because documentation mattered. Because truth included people changing. Because maybe someday someone would want to understand the full story, and Diane's acknowledgement was part of that. I didn't write back. Had nothing to say to her that needed saying. But I didn't hate her anymore either. Just saw her as someone who'd made terrible choices and was living with the consequences. Human and flawed and paying for her mistakes. That felt like enough. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that people are complicated and justice is messy. And sometimes the ending isn't dramatic resolution, but quiet acceptance that harm was done and accounted for. 1 year after Tom's death, I stood by his wall at sunset and thought about what we'd accomplished together. His planning and my execution. His documentation and my persistence. His engineering and my willingness to finish what he'd started. The wall had weathered a year of seasons. Rain and sun and wind and snow. The concrete had darkened slightly. The garden had filled in. The visible chamber had become a neighborhood landmark. Physical proof that truth survives. That preparation defeats corruption. That love keeps promises even across death. Tom's fight was finished. Diane was in prison. The HOA was reformed. The community was healing. Justice had happened. Truth had prevailed. And I was still here, still living, still figuring out what comes after the big promise is kept and the defining fight is won. I'd started teaching again. Part-time, just 2 classes. A P English, helping students learn that words matter. That documentation protects. That standing up to bullies requires preparation and patience and willingness to see the long game through. Some of them got it. Most didn't yet. But that was okay. Teaching had always been about planting seeds and trusting they'd grow even if you didn't see the harvest. I'd also started writing. About Tom. About the fight. About what I'd learned finishing someone else's battle. Not for publication necessarily, just to process. To preserve. To document the way Tom had taught me to. Maybe someday it would help someone else facing their own HOA tyrant, their own David versus Goliath fight, their own impossible promise to someone they'd loved and lost. Or maybe it would just be therapy, words on paper helping me understand what we'd been through and who I'd become because of it. Either way, the writing felt right, felt like honoring Tom's systematic approach while using my own voice, balancing his engineering with my humanity. As the sun set and shadows stretched across the wall, I thought about what Tom had written in that journal entry about balance, about how we'd completed each other, about how his blueprints and my humanity together made a complete picture. We still did, even with death between us. His plan and my execution, his evidence and my presentation, his wall and my willingness to make it visible. Together we'd proven that truth matters, that documentation protects, that preparation defeats those who think rules don't apply, that love finishes what needs finishing. The wall stood witness to all of it, 40 feet of concrete and steel and preserved evidence, monument to one engineer's foresight and one widow's promise kept. Some boundaries hold no matter how hard people try to drive through them. Some truths survive every attempt at burial. Some promises transcend death. And some walls, properly built and properly defended, stand forever as witness to what matters most. Truth, justice, love that refuses to quit. Tom had built that wall knowing he might not live to see it completed. But he'd built it anyway. Because some legacies are worth creating even when you won't be there to witness them. I was his legacy now, his voice across death, his fight concluded, his truth preserved. The wall stood and would keep standing long after everyone involved was gone. Physical proof that one good man fought for what was right, and one widow made sure that fight mattered. That was enough, more than enough, everything it needed to be. I touched the concrete one more time, felt its solidity under my fingers, and headed inside. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, new promises to keep, new purposes to find beyond finishing what Tom had started. But tonight I could rest. The promise was kept, the fight was won, the truth stood preserved, and love properly honored had finished what needed finishing. The wall would keep watch, would stand witness, would remind everyone who saw it that boundaries matter and truth survives and preparation defeats corruption. That was Tom's final gift, not just to me, but to everyone who'd ever faced a tyrant and wondered if fighting back was worth it. The answer was yes, documented, preserved, standing solid in concrete and steel. Yes, always yes, fight back. Document everything. Trust that truth, properly protected, survives. The wall proved it every single day.